Our story begins with a girl whose talent was so poor that after 10 years of study, she was still practicing the absolute basics. Naturally, her sex sent her packing, so she simply moved on to find another master at a different gate. But 10 years later, the result was exactly the same, and this cycle continued more times than she cared to count. Eventually, word got around, and every single sect in the cultivation world decided they didn't want her anymore, which tells you everything you need to know. With no other choice, she retreated to the deep mountains to wait for the story's true heroine to finally make an appearance. Her plan was simple: wait for the chaos to start and then head over to watch the spectacle for a bit of fun. However, she soon realized that waiting for the heroine would take nearly 1,000 years, a bit of a long wait, to be honest. To keep her mind from slipping, she created a special spiritual calendar to track the passing of the centuries. And so, we see her settling into the deep mountains, letting the days blur into one another. For a cultivator in deep meditation, time moves with frightening speed. What felt like a few hours to her was actually 10 days or even half a month in the real world. In those early years, our protagonist, Su Ran, wasn't quite used to the rhythm of such a long life. She spent her time growing vegetables in the yard and occasionally heading down the mountain to hunt monsters for a little extra coin. While she only earned a pittance each time, 1,000 years is a very long time to save up, as it turns out. She had actually become quite wealthy, and here we find Su Ran yawning as she rests her chin in her hand, lost in thought. She glanced back at her handmade spiritual calendar, but just as she was about to look away, something caught her eye. She suddenly noticed that the numbers for the current year didn't look quite right. It turned out she had completely missed the era when the heroine was supposed to save the world. It was already the 3rd year since the heroine's ascension, and as she moved, her old clothes began to crumble into dust. Su Ran suddenly realized the truth. She had literally been sitting by the window, daydreaming, for 4 entire years. Wondering how her vegetable garden and fields had fared, Su Ran changed her clothes and went out to check on her land. Deep down, she had already expected the worst, but seeing it in person was another matter entirely. As she looked at the 2-meter-high weeds choking out a few stray stalks of rice, she couldn't help but let out a long, weary sigh. And so, Su Ran rolled up her trouser legs and stepped down into the muddy field. She spent the entire afternoon clearing away the majority of the weeds as a gentle mountain breeze began to blow. The few remaining, sparse stalks of rice swayed back and forth in the wind. Suddenly, it occurred to her that these measly scraps of rice weren't worth an entire afternoon of hard labor. With a final wave of her hand, she grabbed her sickle and headed back. After all, she didn't actually need to eat. No matter how little talent she had been practicing her cultivation every single day. A full 1,004 years had passed. By now, even a pig would have cultivated a human form. To be honest, the same should certainly be true for someone as diligent as Su Ran. While it was true that her talent was poor, enough to be rejected by countless sects, Su Ran never looked down on herself, and she remained remarkably perceptive. Plus, with her immortality buff, she simply had far more time on her hands than anyone else. We see her walking slowly back to her small wooden cabin, lost in the quiet of the mountains. She sat by the window once more, wondering what she should do next to pass the time. In her previous life, she had been transported to this world only a month after starting university. In the original book, the story actually begins with the heroine already residing in the heavenly realm. The plot mostly follows the heroine's life after her ascension, an event Su Ran had missed by nearly 1,000 years. She had also been waiting for the heroine to appear, mostly just to find a bit of entertainment. As Su Ran packed her things, she recalled the cultivators who had looked down on her 1,000 years ago. Things were certainly different now for the cultivators of this world. Extending one's lifespan was an impossible dream, no matter how high their cultivation level reached. By the time they hit 100, they were nothing but withered wood. Yet, the legends of ascension remained. If one could ascend before their life slipped away, they would receive a divine revelation and become a true immortal. Of course, ascending was incredibly difficult, requiring one to accumulate a massive amount of merit first. The heroine, for instance, had ascended on the spot after slaying the demon king. Su Ran finished packing and realized she didn't own much, just 2 sickles and a cleaver. She had 2 hoes, 3 sets of clothes, a bamboo hat, and that small basket from under the eaves. She tucked her clothes into the basket, added a cleaver, and prepared to head down the mountain at last. Though she had no idea what had happened over the last 4 years, she felt it was time to see the world. A millennium ago, unable to defeat the demon clans, she had simply chosen to go into hiding. Back then, she could only hunt low-level magical beasts to get by, but now the demon king was dead. With the demon clans in total disarray, she could finally wander freely, and so, she reached the foot of the mountain. There, Su Ran encountered a handsome young boy who looked strangely familiar to her. She wondered if she was mistaken, until he called out, "Immortal Su Ran, you've finally come down." The boy's eyes lit up as he told her that his grandmother had been worried about her. Ever since the demon king was defeated 3 years ago, their village had been free from magical beasts. Even so, the old woman constantly fretted that something might have happened to the immortal. After all, he had grown up watching the immortal descend the mountain to purge magical beasts. She was truly formidable. Gripping a simple cleaver, she would slaughter everything in her path, no matter how terrifying the beast. They were utterly powerless before her, so he never once worried that she might be in any real danger. From the moment he began keeping track of time, the immortal had always seemed about 10 years older than him. Now that he had grown to be 14, the immortal still looked exactly as she did in his earliest memories. She hadn't changed at all, and we know that no ordinary person could stay so youthful for so many years. He recalled his grandmother saying that even when she was a child, the immortal already lived on this peach mountain. Back then, everyone called her the Peach Immortal. Su Ran looked at the young boy before her and smiled. Suddenly, she remembered who he was. "Xiao Nian, how is your grandmother's health these days?" she asked. "Grandmother is doing very well," he replied, noting she had even tried to climb the mountain to visit last year. However, the path to the immortal's home was far too difficult, and the old woman was forced to give up. Xiao Nian was much more mature than he had been 4 years ago. He was a young man now, after all. In the eyes of his parents, he was already reaching the age where one considers marriage and starting a family. Su Ran went to visit Xiao Nian's grandmother and gently explained that she would no longer be living on the mountain. She was preparing to travel, and though the old woman was sad to hear she was leaving, she understood. She didn't try to make her stay, but she did have one request: for Su Ran to take her grandson to find a master. In the past, while the demon clans were rampaging across the land, this small village had been quite fortunate. Because an immortal had resided here for 1,000 years, they had been able to live a life of absolute peace. When her grandson was younger and wanted to join a sect, she had feared the danger of fighting the demons. But now that the demon clans were extinct and only a few beasts remained, she felt it was time for her grandson. For years, Xiao Nian had been clamoring to join a sect and learn the arts, but his grandmother had always forbidden it due to the danger. Now, however, she felt that if the boy truly wanted to go, he should be allowed to follow his heart. When Su Ran heard the old woman's request, she found herself momentarily at a loss for words. We should note that Xiao Nian had been fascinated by spells and magic since he was a small child. Even though Su Ran had initially intended for him to find a proper master at a sect, she had occasionally taught him a few incantations herself. Su Ran knew her own talent was lacking, to be perfectly honest, but even she could see that Xiao Nian possessed a truly remarkable natural gift for the arts. Had he been born 10 years earlier, he might have made a legendary name for himself within a great sect. While there was less glory to be found now, it was certainly safer, so Su Ran eventually agreed to help. Out of respect for Shushu, she decided she would personally escort Xiao Nian to his destination. Now, Shushu was actually the grandmother's original name. Her full name was Yunshu, though few in the village actually remembered it anymore. Ever since Yunshu had married, her identity had slowly shifted away from her name. She had become So-and-so's wife, and once she had children, she was simply known as So-and-so's mother. And since Xiao Nian's birth, everyone simply referred to her as Xiao Nian's grandmother, as is often the way. Hearing Su Ran use her given name made Yunshu feel a bit dazed. It had been over 30 years since she last heard it. No one called her that anymore, except for for the peach immortal whenever she descended from the mountain. Only she used that name, though Yunshu felt a bit strange being addressed like a young girl now that she was a grandmother. It was a bit awkward, perhaps, but as for Xiao Nian, learning that his grandmother finally consented to him joining a sect made him absolutely overjoyed, as one might expect. After all, this was the dream he had been nurturing for more than 10 years. It was quite a surprise that in the very year Su Ran planned to travel, the grandmother finally agreed to let him seek a master. After packing his things, Xiao Nian even took the time to write a letter to his parents. He asked them to bring his grandmother to live in the city and discuss the plan with her as well. The grandmother promised him she would indeed move to the city to stay with them. Only then did he feel at peace enough to follow Su Ran and leave the village behind. Su Ran didn't bother saying goodbye to the rest of the villagers as they departed. It was the height of the busy farming season, so everyone was out in the fields while Xiao Nian followed Su Ran. Looking at her simple, unadorned appearance, one would find it hard to believe her true nature. How could anyone tell she was an immortal who had lived for many years? Xiao Nian couldn't help but ask a question. Immortal Su Ran, you're so powerful. Why don't you go challenge the Demon King? If you went, I think the Demon King would have been killed much sooner. Hearing this, Su Ran stopped in her tracks. She pointed at herself with a look of utter disbelief. Her slaying the Demon King? She wondered who had given him such a wild delusion, imagining that she was capable of such a feat. Xiao Nian nodded earnestly, insisting that he had never met anyone more powerful than her. Su Ran gently rubbed his head, noting that he was still young and had met very few people. He only thought she was the strongest because of his limited world. Once he met true masters, he would see the truth. She was actually a very ordinary person, not powerful at all. Now, the nearest sect to the village was over 200 miles away. At Su Ran's own speed, she could have arrived in less than an hour. But Xiao Nian certainly couldn't keep up, and she was in no particular hurry to reach their destination. There was no need to exhaust themselves. Walking a bit and resting a bit seemed like a perfectly fine way to travel. When evening arrived, Su Ran simply chose a random spot to rest, as long as it offered a bit of shelter from the wind. Xiao Nian, however, was a bit frightened. After all, the edge of a forest like this is exactly where wild beasts or monsters tend to appear. Both beasts and monsters have a taste for humans, but despite her fear, she knew they still had to eat dinner. So, Xiao Nian set off to gather firewood and start a fire, even though Su Ran hadn't explicitly asked for a meal. Still, she prepared a portion for Su Ran anyway. In the past, her grandmother had always been the one responsible for the cooking. But as her grandmother grew older over the last 2 years, the duty of preparing meals had naturally fallen to her. As they sat by the fire, we see Su Ran reach out and trace a simple circle in the empty air. Xiao Nian watched the ring of shimmering blue light with wide eyes, wondering what the immortal was up to. Feeling a bit confused, she listened as Su Ran explained it was a water-based spell to prevent the fire from spreading into the woods. Then, Su Ran's expression turned uncharacteristically serious. Xiao Nian, she said, you must remember one thing. Xiao Nian hadn't expected her to be so solemn, so she immediately straightened up and waited for Su Ran to speak. Please, tell me, immortal. Su Ran looked at her and told her to remember that neither mountains of gold nor silver could ever compare to the value of clear waters and green mountains. She spoke with absolute, quiet sincerity. This was a lesson carved into her mind since childhood, one she hadn't forgotten even after 1,000 years. Xiao Nian stared at Su Ran, quite surprised that an immortal would offer such humble, earthly advice. To be honest, in her own young mind, these wild mountains couldn't possibly be as important as Su Ran herself, and if she truly had to choose, she was fairly certain she would prefer mountains of actual gold and silver. But she didn't dare share that thought with Su Ran, so she simply nodded to show she had taken the lesson to heart. Su Ran didn't press the matter further, merely gesturing with her chin for the girl to get back to the cooking. And so, Xiao Nian reached into her basket and pulled out 2 bowls and 2 pairs of chopsticks for their meal. After serving the food, Xiao Nian handed it to Su Ran, noting it was the immortal's favorite dish. I only brought enough for today, though, she admitted. By tomorrow, we'll be down to dry rations. Unless they happened upon a town or village, they were out of luck. But Su Ran simply began eating. The meal wasn't quite up to professional standards, but it was delicious nonetheless, and she wasn't worried about the supplies. To be honest, Su Ran didn't mind because she could simply enter a meditative trance for weeks at a time. In that state, any fresh vegetables or meat would have rotted away into nothing long before she woke. We should mention that Su Ran didn't possess a storage ring. She had only been an outer sect disciple. Since storage rings were high-level spiritual tools, she simply couldn't afford one back then. But if she couldn't buy one, she decided to study the problem herself. She had plenty of time, after all. After 5 years of dedicated research, Su Ran finally perfected her own storage formation. The space inside was actually quite vast, holding a millennium's worth of silver and her favorite snacks. It was a bit more complicated to operate than a standard ring, but it served her purposes perfectly. While a ring only requires a thought to retrieve items, her custom formation required a bit more effort. She had to manifest a small array first to pull things out. Seeing Su Ran eating in silence, Xiao Nian sighed. The girl lowered her head and finished her own meal. Once dinner was over, the work wasn't quite done. Xiao Nian took a stick and circled their camp, tapping the ground to scare off any lingering snakes or pests. When she returned, she found their humble campsite had been completely transformed into a cozy retreat. A screen now stood by the fire, shielding a small wooden bed complete with a warm quilt and pillow. As for Su Ran, she was resting atop a large, bulging cloth bag that looked quite comfortable. The immortal was nestled into the bag, while a shimmering light floated right before her eyes. A white light radiated from a small formation, and as Xiao Nian watched Su Ran, her eyes were filled with pure admiration. To her, immortal Su Ran was undoubtedly the most powerful person she had ever met. Once Su Ran finished setting up for the night, she gave a casual wave of her hand, and the glowing light of the formation vanished instantly. The strange characters dissolved into smoke as Su Ran asked the girl why she was out there beating the grass to startle snakes. Su Ran tilted her head toward the approaching Xiao Nian, noting that while the child claimed to believe in her power, she still didn't seem to fully trust in her protection. Not entirely, anyway. Still, Su Ran decided this was a good trait. A strong sense of safety meant the girl wouldn't easily suffer in the future. Xiao Nian explained she wanted to check for hidden animals, noting that while some beasts fear fire, others are actually drawn to the light, making it essential to scout the perimeter. Otherwise, one might be eaten in their sleep without ever knowing. With that, Xiao Nian sat on the edge of the bed. Though she hesitated to fully settle in, to be honest, she still wasn't certain if this comfortable bed was actually meant for her. Su Ran told her to sleep, promising no beasts would bother them. With a simple snap of her fingers, a glowing semicircular barrier expanded from above their heads, enveloping their entire campsite in a protective light. Xiao Nian let out a soft sound of acknowledgement at Su Ran's words. But just as she prepared to take off her shoes, Su Ran pointed out the basin and hot water nearby. She was told to rinse her mouth and wash her face and feet before bed. Following Su Ran's gaze toward the foot of the bed, she saw that everything had been perfectly prepared. After finishing her washing, she couldn't help but look at Su Ran again. Noticing the immortal was now holding a book, she realized she could actually read the characters on the cover. She asked if the immortal was still studying cultivation techniques. Xiao Nian had always dreamed of cultivation, and during the new year, she had even asked her neighbors about it, hearing that one of their distant relatives was a member of a sect. Because of that, she had asked a few questions, and she actually recognized this book on the essentials of cultivation, which every sect disciple possesses. Everyone has a copy, but Su Ran simply replied that her own foundation was quite poor. No matter which immortal sect she visited, she was always told she lacked talent and a solid base, so this particular manual became the very book she studied whenever she had a spare moment to herself. She found that revisiting it always brought new insights, though it also meant all of Su Ran's attack spells remained quite basic. When Xiao Nian heard the immortal claim her foundation was poor, she immediately scrambled up from the bed in protest. She insisted that immortal Su Ran's foundation wasn't poor at all, not in the slightest. After all, she killed magical beasts with a single punch or a single blade, and even from a distance, a mere wave of her hand could strike them down instantly. Su-ran just smiled and told her to sleep, as they had a long journey ahead tomorrow. She warned the girl that she wouldn't allow any oversleeping, then tucked her book away and signaled for Xiaoyan to rest. Then, she closed her own eyes, though she didn't dare enter a deep meditative trance just yet. The last time she had meditated, for years had passed in what felt like a single heartbeat. For Su-ran, such a span of time was negligible, but for an ordinary person, it is an eternity. It is the difference between a small child and a young man grown tall. A sobering thought, really. The next morning, we find that Su-ran woke up quite early, as is her habit. She had long since grown accustomed to the morning songs of birds and insects, and the following days passed much the same way. They encountered no real danger on the road and soon arrived safely at the gates of the sect. Su-ran had never stayed at this particular sect before. In fact, she hadn't even known it existed. However, she heard from the townspeople that this place had already been established for 400 years. It was a sect with a long history, and Xiaoyan stood by her side, listening to every detail with absolute fascination. To Su-ran, however, this sect felt incredibly young. She couldn't help but ask the passerby if they had ever heard of the Tianzhao sect. It was a casual question, really, but she felt a certain nostalgia since it was the very first immortal sect she had ever joined. She had spent nearly a year there, after all. But when the stranger heard her question, he looked at her with a rather peculiar expression. It was the look one gives a complete idiot. He asked her how she could possibly be ignorant of the greatest sect in the world. He wondered aloud if she had been living under a rock, noting that the Tianzhao sect is world famous and known by everyone. 1,000 years ago, the warriors of the Tianzhao sect had already fought their way directly into the heart of the demon clan's lair. They were only a single step away from slaying the demon king back then, and 1,000 years later, it was still a disciple of that same sect. That disciple personally took the demon king's head. One could say that without the Tianzhao sect, the current peace simply wouldn't exist. Feeling a bit embarrassed, Su-ran rubbed the back of her head. It was true, in a way. She really was just a traveler from the mountains. She hadn't left her seclusion in many years. Seeing this, Xiaoyan glanced at her and quickly smiled, skillfully changing the subject. The girl began asking about the sect's entrance exams, and the man, to his credit, was happy to share everything he knew. We learned that this Qingxian sect recruits new disciples once a year in July, which, as luck would have it, was the current month. The recruitment was set to begin the day after tomorrow, and just like that, the day of the trials finally arrived. Standing on the sect's testing grounds, Su-ran felt quite confident in Xiaoyan's abilities. She believed Xiaoyan's talent far surpassed her own. If she could enter a sect, then the girl would certainly have no problem. However, she never imagined that the phrase, a once-in-a-millennium genius, would soon be associated with her young companion. As they watched the spirit testing stone emit a brilliant, blinding golden light, the truth became clear to everyone present. Su-ran realized immediately that Xiaoyan was perfectly suited for lightning-based spells, and among wind, fire, and water, lightning is the most lethal. It possesses the highest offensive power of all. As soon as the crowd heard there was a lightning talent among them, they all rushed forward. Xiaoyan looked around at the growing crowd and the sect elders, all of whom were singing her praises with utter amazement. For a moment, Xiaoyan felt a bit embarrassed, but she couldn't help feeling a touch of pride as well. After all, we all feel a spark of joy when being praised, and Xiaoyan was certainly no exception. Even so, her first instinct was to look at Su-ran. What she craved most was the approval of her mentor. Su-ran saw the girl looking her way and knew exactly what she was after, a little bit of validation. Children always hope for praise from those they hold dear, and in this massive, unfamiliar sect, Su-ran was the only person Xiaoyan truly knew. With a warm smile, Su-ran gave her a silent thumbs up. Not a single word was spoken, yet for Xiaoyan, this felt like the most extraordinary achievement of all. She had gained the recognition of the person she admired most, and to her, there was no better reward. Suddenly, a jarring voice cut through the air, noting that high talent often comes with an equally high cost. The voice sneered that even with lightning talent, the sect couldn't possibly lavish all its resources on just one person. Coming to the trials without money, the stranger mocked, wondering if she was prepared to bankrupt her entire family. This brought the crowd back to reality, reminding them that the path to immortality isn't just about spending money. To be perfectly honest, it's more like burning money. Even ordinary families who send their children to sects usually prepare a small fortune in advance. And while lightning talents are almost always geniuses, they are notoriously difficult to train. The lightning tribulations they face are far more brutal than anyone else's. Unless a family is exceptionally wealthy and can provide endless magical treasures and pills, the risk is immense. If the sect and family invest everything only for the disciple to fail the tribulation, well, that's that. All that effort would be wasted. Many believe that the gold required to raise one lightning genius could easily train a dozen disciples of other elements. Having had cold water thrown on her joy, Xiaoyan lowered her head. Su-ran wondered who exactly said she had no money, especially coming from someone who likely had nothing without their parents. Su-ran thought to herself that if his father were the one speaking, she might not argue, but these two were clearly cut from the same cloth. How could someone who couldn't produce a single tael of silver on their own merit have the nerve to claim someone else was poor? To be honest, Su-ran didn't want to get involved in a petty dispute, but this particular child was being truly insufferable. Even if there was a grain of truth in his words, saying something so discouraging at a person's happiest moment was simply cruel. It was, quite frankly, a very punchable offense. In Su-ran's eyes, however, Xiaoyan wasn't exactly a once-in-a-lifetime genius. Having been selected for the inner sect 5,000 years ago, she knew that genius was a term small sects threw around far too lightly. The young man found himself completely silenced by Su-ran's sharp retort, unable to find a single word to fire back. Seeing their leader falter, his little group of followers immediately stepped forward to speak up on his behalf. Upon hearing the escalating tension, the surrounding crowd quickly distanced themselves from Su-ran and Xiaoyan, fearing they might be implicated. Xiaoyan began to feel a surge of anxiety. After all, her heart was set on joining the sect. She knew Su-ran was only speaking up to defend her, but she feared that if this continued, her chances would vanish. Just as she was about to apologize to the young master who, Su-ran stepped forward and took her by the hand. Su-ran told her they weren't staying here a moment longer, promising to take her to the Tianzhao sect instead. In Su-ran's view, a sect founded a mere 400 years ago lacked the true foundation and heritage she possessed herself. She realized that if Xiaoyan joined a sect that judged people so superficially, the girl would surely suffer once Su-ran left. She had noticed the girl's hesitation earlier and knew Xiaoyan had been moments away from offering an apology. But why should she apologize? Simply because she possessed the lightning element and a bit more talent than the rest? Even if lightning users required more resources, the crowd looked on in utter disbelief. What kind of place did she think the Tianzhao sect was? Did she really believe one could just walk into such a prestigious institution whenever they pleased? Only Xiaoyan stood there in shock. She believed Su-ran's words were true, yet she wondered if she truly belonged in the Tianzhao sect. After all, that was the very sect where the world-saving heroes resided, a place of immense prestige. The disciple in charge of the testing grew anxious seeing such a rare talent prepare to leave, despite the risks of the lightning element. We learned that the sect master of Tianzhao had recently discovered a spiritual message left in a demon cave by a senior disciple from 1,000 1,000 years ago. The message claimed someone knew how to resist the lightning tribulations, though it was unclear if that person was still among the living. But since that senior disciple insisted anyone could seek them out, it suggested clues could still be found even 1,000 years later. Wait, you two, please hold on, the managing disciple called out hurriedly, hoping to stop their departure. Su Ren ignored him completely, but Xiao Nian's pace slowed. Deep down, she still felt staying with the sect would be for the best. To be honest, entering the Tianzhao sect wouldn't just bring honor to the Xing family name. It would bring glory to their entire county, as this was a sect that had produced true immortals who ascended to the upper realms. Yet, she didn't want to make things difficult for Su Ren, who had already helped her and the villagers so many times. Do you not trust me? Su Ren asked, pulling on Xiao Nian's hand to keep her moving forward. Su Ren didn't particularly want to manage Xiao Nian's life, but she couldn't ignore the fact that the girl was Su Su's direct descendant. She certainly wasn't going to let her be bullied here. In over 1,000 years in the cultivation world, she had very few friends. Su Su had been one of them, and the other had been gone for centuries. Xiao Nian's hesitant steps finally steadied. Upon hearing Su Ran's firm words, she stopped doubting. Her grandmother had once told her a very important lesson. She said that if she ever felt uncertain, she should listen to the immortal Tao Tao, for the grandmother had once failed to do so. That single mistake had led to a lifetime of tears. Xiao Nian knew that, back then, her grandmother hadn't wanted to marry. Su Ran had even come down from the mountain to offer to take her away, promising her a life of cultivation. She had promised that no one would ever trouble her again, but the grandmother had married anyway just to save her parents' face. So, when Su Ran turned to look at her now, Xiao Nian shook her head vigorously like a rattle, signaling her absolute trust. She knew Xiao Nian trusted her, but she couldn't help but point out the girl's true, lingering thoughts with a knowing look. And it was true that the prestige of the Tianzhao sect today was simply incomparable to what it once was. Getting a talent like Xiao Nian into such a place could be seen as difficult, or perhaps, not difficult at all. After all, a lightning element talent is a prize for any sect, a seedling with limitless potential. But as the saying goes, the brightest stars often burn out the fastest, especially when dealing with the volatile lightning element. While she would possess combat power far beyond her peers, the risks she would have to shoulder were equally immense. Seeing them prepare to leave, the managing disciple immediately sent word to the sect elders. He couldn't let a lightning talent slip away. If he failed, his career as a manager would be over, regardless of how much the Hu family had assisted the sect. Even though they donated 50,000 taels of silver annually, a single lightning element cultivator was worth far more. To an immortal sect, such a disciple's value is infinite, especially since the demon king's death hadn't solved everything. Several powerful demon generals under the king's command had yet to be hunted down, despite 3 years of deceptive peace. No one knew how long this tranquility would last, and the sect elder currently had no direct disciples to carry his legacy. Upon hearing that a lightning element cultivator had appeared, he naturally had no intention of letting this chance pass him by. The elder himself possessed the fire element, which was already considered one of the more aggressive and powerful talents. For the past 3 years, the sect had only recruited mediocre students, which had become a constant source of frustration for him. Now that a true genius had finally arrived, the sect elder felt a surge of renewed purpose and anticipation. A lightning talent wasn't just a student, they were a formidable warrior in the making, a force to be reckoned with. The elder understood that such a warrior would be the ultimate shield and sword for the sect's future security. We see the sect elder hurrying toward the scene, his mind already racing with the possibilities of such a rare find. He knew that a powerful warrior like this was something he simply could not afford to miss. This time, the sect elder wasn't just looking for a strong warrior to join their ranks. Naturally, he had no intention of letting a talent like this slip through his fingers. It was as if the sect elder had already been discussed as the final authority here. Su Ren admitted that since he put it that way, she was curious to hear more. The elder, known as Zong Di, decided to offer them a rare opportunity. You see, the Zong Di sect only selects new disciples once every 3 years. Since the last selection was barely 3 months ago, the next one wouldn't be for nearly 3 years. So, he proposed an idea. The girl could become his personal disciple first. In 6 months, he would secure her a spot in the Tianzhao sect, and Su Ran turned to Xiao Nian. She asked the girl what she thought, and Xiao Nian listened intently to Su Ran's question. The girl lowered her head to think seriously, considering what Elder Hong Chang had said. No matter how much she wanted to enter the Tianzhao sect, waiting 3 years would make her 17. Starting her journey at that age would, quite obviously, be a bit too late. Xiao Nian felt she had already troubled Su Ren enough, and joining Elder Hong Chang had benefits. Under his protection, that young master from the Hu family wouldn't dare cause her any more trouble. Hearing that the girl was willing to stay, Su Ren decided not to push the matter further, although she certainly had her ways of forcing Xiao Nian into the Tianzhao sect if she wished. But since Xiao Nian chose to stay, Su Ran let it be. She had promised the girl's uncle, after all. Her mission was simply to deliver Xiao Nian to the sect gates, and she had now fulfilled that task. Seeing Xiao Nian agree, Hong Chang began to tell Su Ran more about how their sect operated. We see that the sect even provides special courtyards for relatives, perfect for a long stay or just a quick visit. But Su Ran stood up, reminding him she wasn't actually the girl's sister, and her job here was done. She announced her departure, leaving Hong Chang a bit stunned by how quickly she was moving on. He asked where she was headed, noting that as a cultivator herself, she must belong to some sect. Su Ran just waved her hand dismissively, claiming she'd been expelled for having absolutely terrible talent. She was just a wanderer now, an explanation that, quite naturally, left Hong Chang feeling rather skeptical. To him, she looked no more than 16, and while her cultivation seemed to be at the basic chi refining stage, he couldn't help but notice that her aura felt strangely elusive, appearing and disappearing at will. It was a sensation he had only encountered once before, exactly 3 years ago. It reminded him of the legendary junior sister who slew the demon king and ascended, and the youths by her side. And yet, looking at the girl before him, her power felt like that of a simple beginner. Hong Chang couldn't change her mind, and since Xiao Nian didn't seem worried, he finally let the matter rest. As Su Ran stepped out of the courtyard, she suddenly realized there was one more question she needed to ask. She turned back to Elder Hong Chang and asked for the way to the home of someone named Shinjiwu. The moment he heard that name, Hong Chang gave her a long, searching look. He quickly realized, however, that since Shinjiwu was the hero who killed the demon king, everyone knew him. It was only natural for a young girl to ask about such a legend out of pure admiration. He told her the Shin family was easy to find, located right in the capital of the Longyu kingdom. With the address in hand, Su Ran set off toward Longyu, but she had barely reached the mountain's base when she suddenly remembered a rather vital detail. Xiao Nian possessed a rare lightning-type talent. Every time someone with that talent advances, they have to face one more bolt of heavenly lightning than an ordinary person. Normally, the number of lightning strikes is proportional to one's cultivation level, and while they leave a person weakened, they usually stop just at the brink of death. But that extra bolt from a lightning talent changes everything. It can easily strike a person dead. When Su Ran first heard the cultivation world worked this way, she thought it seemed a bit unfair. However, after seeing the sheer combat power of lightning users, she decided it was actually quite justified. To maintain balance, a world must have both rewards and punishments. Those with lightning talents really do feel like they're using a cheat code, so Su Ran turned back up the mountain. This time, without Xiao Nian by her side, she easily slipped back into the sect unnoticed. When Xiao Nian saw her, a bright smile lit up his face, thinking the immortal Su Ran had changed her mind and decided to stay. "Come here, I'm going to give you a buff," Su Ran said, beckoning him over. Xiao Nian didn't understand the word, but he obediently walked toward her anyway, even if he didn't know what a buff was. He knew that whatever the immortal gave him was bound to be good. Su Ran placed her hand over his dantian, muttering a few words under her breath until a strange hairpin appeared, resting against the small of the boy's back. She told him he could practice in peace now, as he could withstand any lightning tribulation below the great success stage. As for anything beyond that, he'd have to find his own way. After all, once you survive that, you've basically ascended. She added that she'd return to visit his grandmother soon, telling him to make sure she stays healthy and doesn't pass away. As Xiao Nian watched Su Ran's silhouette disappear through the window, he called out one last thing. He begged her to remember to come back early, reminding her that as mere humans, they don't have much time. The villagers had no idea how long the immortal Tao Tao had lived, but the grandmother knew the truth. Because Su Ran had once told her she was already 1,000 years old, which, naturally, left Xiao Nian feeling quite worried. Xiao Nian watched her go, fearing deep down that once the immortal Su Ran left, he might never see her again. Hearing his words, Su Ran turned back once more and gently patted his head. She asked how many years they had known each other, and when he answered 9, she nodded, noting that it was indeed quite a long time. While 9 years felt like a mere blink of an eye to her, she realized that for Xiao Nian, it was practically a lifetime. It reminded her of Uncle. She had only intended to stay angry with him for a little while, but by the time her anger had faded and she went to find him, his grandson was already 4 or 5 years old. And now, in another blink, the little brat who used to chase after her had grown into a handsome young man. With a final wave, she promised to return in 5 years, and her digital calendar flickered back into existence. She set a memo on the calendar before heading down the mountain toward the city. She needed to find out exactly where the Longyu Kingdom was, but whenever she asked for directions, people looked at her as if she were completely losing her mind. Still, seeing her serious expression, they eventually told her that Longyu lay at the easternmost edge of the cultivation world, where the Tianzhao sect is located. Su Ran was puzzled, wondering if the Longyu in the kingdom's name was the same as the old Longyu town. Back then, that country didn't even exist. It seemed the town mayor had upgraded to emperor. Quite an achievement, really. Having confirmed the location and no longer slowed down by her little companion, Su Ran traveled thousands of miles a day. In less than 2 days, she reached the capital of Longyu, just as the Tianzhao sect's disciple selection had concluded. The entire capital was still buzzing with excitement. Su Ran looked at the unfamiliar city, unable to imagine that this place had once been a mere seaside village, constantly harassed by fish monsters. As she walked, she found herself jostled by the crowd, forced to simply follow the flow of the people. Today was the birthday of the Venerable Ji, and everyone around her was wondering if his good fortune might fall upon them. The moment Su Ran heard the people around her discussing this, she immediately perked up her ears to listen closely. She had no idea who this Venerable Ji was. After staying in the mountains for so long, she had become quite the hermit. As she listened to their explanations, we see the realization dawn on her. This Venerable Ji was actually Shinji. He was the same man who once clung to her leg, calling her his savior. Though, to be honest, he was always a bit of a rogue. He was a cunning one, and Su Ran found it hard to believe that Shinji had been remembered for 1,000 years. She vividly remembered the time he stole her roast chicken and ate it, only to turn around and say with a straight face that his name would surely go down in history one day. At the time, Su Ran didn't pay it much mind. After all, this was a novel world, and novel worlds are supposed to have proper protagonists. Someone like Shinji didn't seem like a hero at all, mostly because he still owed her 1,000 silver taels. Thinking of Shinji, she suddenly recalled that debt from 1,000 years ago. It was a considerable sum back then. The purchasing power of that silver was far greater than it is now, yet here his descendants were, spending a fortune on a birthday parade. Back in the day, aside from her cooking him a bowl of longevity noodles, who would have even remembered his birthday? He was a family outcast, disliked by his father and pushed aside by his brother. If not for his lightning talent, the Shin family would have bullied him to death. Yet now, he was worshipped by them as a venerable ancestor. As the ceremonial carriage approached from the distance, the surrounding crowd suddenly fell into a hushed silence. Su Ran looked toward the carriage, but instead of a golden statue or a memorial tablet, she saw a young man. He wore a red robe embroidered with gold thread, holding a lightning patterned sword as his gaze swept over the onlookers. Su Ran took one look at that sword and knew it was a fake. Meanwhile, the young man on the carriage looked down at the crowd. Did these people truly want a blessing? No, they were simply hoping for money. His gaze continued to drift across the faces of the crowd until his eyes met a look of pure, unmistakable disdain. That look caused a tiny crack to appear in his otherwise perfect expression. Su Ran, for her part, hadn't expected to be noticed. Realizing she'd been caught mocking the Shin family, she quickly slipped away. He'd only glanced at her once, after all. She assumed he wouldn't remember her face. But an hour later, when that same young man appeared with several cultivators and cornered her in a small alleyway, Su Ran truly wished she could go back 1,000 years to help Shinji clean house. The young man saw that she was indeed just a young girl, and one whose cultivation was only at the chi refining stage. With a wave of his hand, he signaled the other cultivators to step back, deciding he could handle this himself. Su Ran, however, felt like being honest. She told him quite plainly that she did, in fact, have a problem with all this. After all, the great Shinji still owed her 1,000 silver taels. To her, that was a very valid grievance. The young man, Shin Jianchuan, couldn't help but burst out laughing when he heard her bold claim. It was common knowledge throughout the cultivation world that their ancestor had once owed someone 1,000 taels. But that was 1,000 years ago. The original creditor had surely turned to dust long ago, or so everyone assumed. This girl wasn't even as old as he was, yet here she was, claiming his ancestor owed her a fortune. The audacity was almost impressive. Su Ran hadn't expected that her next meeting with Shinji would take place inside a temple dedicated to his memory. At the very center of the temple hung a massive portrait, depicting a handsome young man with a sharp, noble gaze. The long sword with lightning patterns in the painting was a perfect match for the real one Shinji used to carry. Shin Jianchuan watched the girl, noting that even in front of the Venerable Ji shrine, she still looked completely unimpressed. So, he decided to challenge her. He asked if she dared to repeat her claim right there in front of the portrait. Do you dare say he owes you money here? He warned her that lying to a venerable could invite a literal bolt of lightning from the heavens. A bit dramatic, perhaps, but that was the tradition. In all these centuries, not a single person had been brave, or foolish, enough to stand before that image and demand 1,000 taels. He looked her over once more. To be honest, she didn't exactly look like someone who had ever seen that much money in her life. He assumed she was just another swindler looking for a quick payout. Su Ran, however, was quite surprised that the young master of the Shin family would try to scare her like this. She wasn't afraid of divine retribution. Dealing with lightning was practically her profession, after all. Feeling a bit exasperated by the situation, she looked at the portrait inside. Shinji, when exactly do you plan on paying back that 1,000 silver taels? She realized that if she actually managed to get the money back from his descendants, she would absolutely have to charge 1,000 years worth of interest. As she stood there calculating just how much that interest would amount to, she failed to notice Shin Jianchuan and his guards behind her. Their hair practically stood on end from the shock of her words. Shinji was the Venerable's private birth name. For a millennium, not a single member of the Shin family had dared to utter it, using only his title out of respect. Yet here was this young girl, not only using his personal name but claiming he owed her specifically. Shin Jianchuan studied her expression and, strangely enough, didn't get the feeling she was lying. And so, he ordered all the temple guards to step outside, even though they wouldn't dare eavesdrop on their young master. Shin Jianchuan still cast a soundproofing spell just to be safe. Su Ran felt the slight ripple of spiritual energy and turned to look at him. She wondered why he was sealing the room. Was he planning to hit her? Perhaps he wanted to make sure no one heard her cry for help. Did the Venerable truly owe you 1,000 taels? Seeing her staring at him, Shin Jianchuan decided to simply ask what was on his mind. If she was telling the truth, there were only two possibilities. First, this girl had lived for over 1,000 years. Or second, she had been tricked by someone pretending to be his famous ancestor. In this world, humans practice cultivation not just to fight demons, but to break the limits of their own mortality. But even with high cultivation, extending one's lifespan significantly was nearly impossible for most in the realm. In this world, no one can live past 200 years. Living for a millennium is a feat beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Besides, someone who had lived for 1,000 years would surely possess an immortal's grace, unlike the young girl standing here. here? She looked no different from an outer disciple of the Tianzhao sect, perhaps even less noticeable than a common trainee. Most importantly, she was merely an introductory cheer-refining disciple. How could she possibly have lived for 1,000 years? Su Ran felt a bit helpless, knowing that even if she told the truth, they wouldn't believe her. Yes, it was a bit of a dilemma. In the past, she feared that if she claimed to be centuries old, people would treat her like some sort of demon or monster. Later on, the simple villagers she met actually began to believe she was an immortal sage living deep within the mountains. But whenever she met city folk and mentioned her age, they would simply smile and say nothing, clearly thinking she was joking. It was happening again. Even though she had come to collect a debt, they still treated her like a common swindler. Shin Jianchuan stared intently at Su Ran, trying to find even the slightest hint of a lie hidden within her eyes. However, whether judging by her expression or her aura, this girl seemed entirely too natural. To be honest, it was quite unsettling. I believe what you say, Shin Jianchuan finally said, withdrawing his gaze and waving his hand to dispel the soundproofing spell. He called for the guards to prepare a room for Su Ran to rest. Now, it was her turn to be confused by the sudden hospitality. She wondered if this boy actually believed her. If he did, then surely the next logical step was to pay back the money. After the guard arrived to take her, Shin Jianchuan became significantly more polite towards Su Ran than he had been before. Su Ran didn't particularly care if he was truly leading her to a guest room or setting some sort of elaborate trap. In the end, as long as she could get her money, nothing else mattered, even though she wasn't exactly desperate for cash anymore. But those 1,000 silver taels represented 10 years of her life spent doing odd jobs for various sections. She wanted them back. Once inside the Shin estate, Su Ran truly understood what it felt like for a single family to occupy an entire district. There were entrance gates in every direction, and we see that every single one of them had its own unique name. Shin Jianchuan led her to a courtyard within a larger suite, featuring a charming two-story building. The entire courtyard was enveloped by a barrier, keeping the temperature perfect and the flowers in full bloom. Su Ran glanced at the neighboring courtyard and noticed that it, too, was protected by its own barrier. However, that yard was a world of pure white, clearly covered in snow. It was Shin Jianchuan's private quarters. Noticing Su Ran staring at his snowy retreat, he asked if she would like to take a look inside. Su Ran was curious, as she often used barriers herself to regulate the seasons in her own home. Still, keeping a yard in a state of perpetual winter was something she would never do. He agreed to let her in. Shin Jianchuan was being unusually agreeable as they stepped together into his frozen sanctuary. Su Ran felt a sudden chill in the air as he asked her how much she truly knew about the Venerable Ji. He watched her observe his garden, wondering why she would ever lend 1,000 silver taels to such a man. He couldn't help but ask. After all, everyone in the Shin family claimed he looked exactly like the Venerable Ji. Even he saw the resemblance, and since the age of 12, he had replaced the golden statue as a living double. He had served as the Venerable Ji's ceremonial stand-in for 4 years now, if we are counting correctly. The Shin family had cultivated his natural talents because his features matched the portraits found in the ancient temples. This was how he became the new young master, though in reality, he was merely a puppet used to maintain their power. Perhaps that is why, when faced with this girl and her wild stories, he chose to believe she had lived 1,000 years. If she truly was that old, she might know how the Venerable Ji broke through to the golden core stage. He was desperate to learn the secret of how his ancestor nearly reached the spirit-severing realm. Yes, he was quite curious. But the Shin family knew very little about this ancestor, who had achieved fame young and never married or had children. Their genealogy only held a few brief lines, noting he was a rare master who wielded the power of lightning. And then there was that note he had stuck to the Shin family gate, which simply read, I owe someone 1,000 silver taels. If they come to collect, remember to pay them back for me. Just one simple sentence, really. It became the final message the Venerable Ji ever left for the family. Seeing Shin Jianchuan questioning her, Su Ran simply smiled. She decided to answer his question with a question of her own, watching him closely. We see that Shin Jianchuan has already reached the peak of foundation establishment. He will likely break through to the golden core stage within 6 months. A 16-year-old golden core cultivator certainly has impressive talent, though he still falls far short of Shin Ji's legendary status. Shin Ji relied entirely on his own strength to survive the lightning tribulations, something ordinary people simply cannot replicate. Shin Jianchuan felt a flicker of embarrassment when Su Ran saw right through his little schemes and hidden motives. But he told himself there was nothing wrong with wanting to survive, or wanting to know how a lightning talent cultivator can advance. This is something every lightning-gifted soul yearns to know. After all, fearing death is only human nature. Su Ran was actually a bit surprised by Shin Jianchuan's frankness, as she didn't have a particularly good impression of the Shin family. It was the same 1,000 years ago, and it seems it remains the same 1,000 years later. The Shin family always seems to push their two greatest geniuses away. It is a cycle that apparently never ends. Over the millennium, this pattern likely repeated constantly, though most of those people died in obscurity without leaving a mark. They weren't like Shin Ji or Shin Jiwoo, whose names were etched in history. Surviving the lightning tribulation isn't actually that difficult, she remarked. Su Ran strolled through the courtyard with her hands behind her back, noting that while Shin Jianchuan was the young master, he lived in the west wing. It was quite clear that he wasn't actually favored. As the young master, he really should have been residing in the east wing. Furthermore, his quarters shouldn't be connected to the guest rooms, and his barrier was of the simplest variety imaginable. It couldn't even change the weather at will. It was permanently fixed to a single, frozen season. The moment Shin Jianchuan heard that Su Ran truly had a solution, he didn't even stop to wonder if she was telling the truth. He nearly rushed forward to cling to her for help, but his years of training as the young master held him back. Restraining the urge to kneel, he asked her to teach him. Shin Jianchuan didn't even know her name yet. If she truly had lived for 1,000 years, then she was undoubtedly a venerable senior to him. Su Ran felt a bit awkward being called senior. To be honest, she hadn't felt much change in the outside world. She spent most of her years in deep meditation, only waking briefly at fixed intervals. After speaking, Su Ran simply snapped her fingers. Shin Jianchuan felt the very atmosphere of his courtyard tremble slightly. It seemed as if everything had changed, yet simultaneously, as if nothing had changed at all. Su Ran spoke with such ease, but Shin Jianchuan found himself completely lost. He had no idea what she meant. He wondered what it meant to install a ground wire in his body. Su Ran saw his confused expression. She realized her explanation was a bit too modern. In a world of cultivation, no one really chooses science. Modern people study how to attract or avoid lightning because it is both useful and dangerous to humanity. But in the cultivation world, lightning is seen as the wrath of the gods. If someone is struck, people simply assume they must have committed some evil deed. They never consider if the person was carrying metal, standing under a tall tree, or if it was just bad luck. What I mean is, she began. You just need to divert the heavenly lightning into the ground when the tribulation arrives. Shin Jianchuan was puzzled. He couldn't see the use in grounding it. After all, if the lightning is powerful enough, it can blast a massive crater into the very earth. Lightning tribulations only target the cultivator and demons. It doesn't actually harm others, so simply diverting the heavenly bolt into the ground is quite sufficient. Su Ren explained this further, having clearly read the doubts written all over Shin Jianchuan's face. It was the same problem his ancestor had discussed with her 1,000 years ago. Some things never change. Since the lightning doesn't harm others or the ground itself, she explained, diverting the tribulation becomes much easier. As Shin Jianchuan listened to Su Ran's words, a thought suddenly occurred to him, and he politely asked for her name. He felt his heart leap into his throat, knowing that her name was a secret held only by a select few. Only the elders and managers of the sects knew it, while ordinary disciples remained in the dark. He only knew because he was a Shin. Su Ran felt that since she had already admitted Shin Ji owed her money, there was no longer any reason to hide her identity. Besides, she noticed this young man was quite deep and cautious for his age, which, to be honest, was a point in his favor. She was certain that even if he knew who she was, he wouldn't go around spreading rumors carelessly. From the moment he took her to Shin Ji's temple and set up a soundproof barrier, Su Ran knew he was careful. It was clear to her that Shin Jianchuan and the rest of the Shin family didn't exactly exactly see eye to eye. The moment he heard the name, Su Ran, he finally understood why the Venerable Ji had spoken of her. He had said that finding Su Ran was the only way to solve the tribulation problems for those with lightning talents. More importantly, it confirmed that Venerable Ji really did owe this woman 1,000 taels of silver. A bit embarrassing, really. For some reason, the perfect image Shen Jianchuan held of his ancestor began to shift slightly after meeting Su Ran. That distant, legendary figure suddenly felt much more human, and Shen Jianchuan found himself feeling uncharacteristically restless. He had assumed she was roughly his own age, but now he had to face the fact that she had truly lived for over a millennium. Su Ran waved her hand to dismiss his awkwardness, and Shen Jianchuan began to recount the events of 3 years ago. He told her how he had retrieved Shen Ji's personal relics from the depths of the demon den. Shen Jianchuan expected Su Ran to offer a solemn sigh or lament over the tragic fate of her old friend. Instead, we see Su Ran simply squatting on the ground to build a snowman while he spoke of the tragedy. Upon hearing that her old friend had met an unfortunate end, she couldn't even resist rolling her eyes. How very sentimental. Seeing that Su Ran didn't seem the least bit saddened by the news, Shen Jianchuan found himself completely at a loss for words. Once Su Ran finished her snowman, she gave her hand a quick flick, wrapping the little figure in a gentle glow of spiritual energy. She then tucked it away into her storage array, leaving Shen Jianchuan staring in shock at the brief flash of the formation. He wondered if that was a pocket dimension, a legendary space supposedly reserved only for the immortals of the upper realms. She decided it was time to move on from the topic of Shenji and focus on the matter at hand. She began to explain exactly how she helped those with lightning talents survive their heavenly tribulations. Imagine the tragedy of a genius dying simply because of an unfair bolt of lightning from the heavens. While such a thing is indeed a pity, she noted that this sentiment certainly didn't apply to Shenji. She insisted the woman deserved her fate, and seeing her so blunt, Shen Jianchuan immediately straightened up. He knew this was a conversation about the very future of every lightning talent in existence. Su Ran turned her palm upward, revealing a small array, and calmly told him to strike her with his heavenly lightning. Shen Jianchuan hesitated, remembering that while Su Ran had lived for a millennium, her cultivation was technically only at the chi refining stage. Even though he hadn't yet faced his own golden core tribulation, he knew the power he commanded was dangerous. After all, summoning heavenly lightning is the most devastating attack a lightning talent possesses. Seeing his hesitation, Su Ran simply waved the array directly in front of him, growing a bit impatient. She told him if he was too afraid, she would do it herself, and gestured for him to crouch down before snapping her fingers. Before Shen Jianchuan could even react, a blinding bolt of lightning came crashing down from the sky. The sheer pressure of that bolt was unlike anything he had ever felt, yet when it struck her array, something strange happened. It was as if the energy was simply absorbed, vanishing with nothing more than a few faint crackles of static. In that moment, Shen Jianchuan began to seriously doubt everything he thought he knew about Su Ran's cultivation level. If that array hadn't been right above his head, blocking the impact, he likely wouldn't have even had time to react. He wondered if this was truly the kind of heavenly lightning a mere chi refining cultivator could summon. More importantly, she hadn't used any spells or incantations at all. She had simply snapped her fingers. The last time Su Ran snapped her fingers, we recall, she was merely adding a little something to the courtyard's barrier. Su Ran pointed toward his feet and explained that the principle behind her array was actually quite simple. She had integrated numerous earth element formations into it, allowing it to completely absorb any natural lightning. This included the lightning from a breakthrough. Any excess energy would simply be channeled safely into the ground. Following Su Ran's gesture, Shen Jianchuan noticed the formation right beneath his own feet. He could even see faint sparks of lightning flickering within it. It was quite clear that the heavenly bolt had already been absorbed by the earth. Shen Jianchuan remained crouched for a long moment before standing. He asked if everyone learning this array would make the ultimate move of a lightning talent completely useless. After all, summoning lightning is what makes them superior to others. Su Ran looked down at him with a steady gaze. She clarified that this specific array cannot be used by anyone except those with a lightning talent. Naturally, she had already considered this. Her goal was to help geniuses thrive, not to hold them back. She had no intention of stopping lightning talents from becoming legends. Meanwhile, far away in the sect master's hall of the Tianzhao sect, the sect master awoke from his deep meditation. He rose and began to walk toward the exit of the great hall. He looked up at the sky, but saw no strange phenomena. Everything in Longyu City appeared perfectly peaceful. He wondered why he had just sensed such an unusual lightning strike, one that appeared and vanished far too quickly. The sect master almost thought it was an illusion, but as a wind talent, his perception was far sharper than most. And so, the sect master of Tianzhao knew it was real. He slowly closed his eyes. He used his spiritual sense to scan the entirety of Longyu City, yet found nothing out of the ordinary. Su Ran sensed that someone was observing her direction, confirming her belief that certain protections were necessary. These cultivators certainly have sensitive intuitions. Even though she had moved with incredible speed, she had still been detected. Had Shen Jianchuan been the one to summon the lightning, he wouldn't have been noticed at all. Noticing that Su Ran's expression had soured, Shen Jianchuan asked if she was all right. She simply replied that she was fine. She told him to study the array on his own and warned him not to tell anyone they were acquainted. Although Su Ran knew Shen Jianchuan wasn't the type to gossip, she felt it was best to mention it anyway. He wondered why, thinking the sect master would surely be overjoyed to know that his senior was still alive. Shen Jianchuan still placed his trust in the sect master of Tianzhao, but Su Ran offered no explanation for her secrecy. The most critical issue, of course, was the fact that she had lived for 1,000 years. Humans naturally crave longevity. After all, that is why they choose the path of cultivation. Fighting demons is one thing, but seeking eternal life is the true goal. As long as life is going well, anyone would choose to live a little longer. Su Ran didn't understand why she was immortal, but she certainly had no desire to become someone's test subject. Yet, there are no walls without cracks. As long as she appeared before others, her secret would eventually be exposed. This risk didn't start when she gave the array to Shen Jianchuan to study. It began the moment she helped Xiao Nia cultivate successfully, or perhaps even earlier than that. Seeing Su Ran turn and leave without a word, Shen Jianchuan realized he had likely said too much. He decided to do exactly as she said. He memorized the array and then ordered his people to prepare the silver. Since Venerable Ji had instructed the Shen family to repay those 1,000 taels, they were naturally going to honor it. But after 1,000 years of interest, that debt was no small sum for anyone to pay back to a friend. The relationship between the two was clearly something special, which left Shen Jianchuan feeling rather envious, as he had no such person in his own life. We see Su Ran return to the guest courtyard and settle inside. Since these quarters were meant for honored guests, the landscaping of the yard, as well as the interior decorations, were quite impressive. Su Ran took a seat on a soft couch to rest. She suddenly remembered that she hadn't removed the barrier she set up earlier, but after a moment's thought, she decided to leave it be. The boy seemed decent enough, and though she wasn't sure if he intended to cause trouble, she didn't mind. If he planned to stir things up for the Shen family, she was all for it, so keeping him hidden for a while was the least she could do. After sitting for a while, she felt a sudden urge to visit the courtyard where Shinjuwu once lived. Even if the Shen family had treated Shinjuwu poorly, she assumed they would have surely preserved his old residence. Hearing Shen Jianchuan enter the courtyard, she turned her head toward the door to see what he wanted. Shen Jianchuan arrived carrying a stack of bank banknotes, calculating the interest on 1,000 taels at 50 taels per year. The interest alone came to 50,000 taels. Adding the original principal, the total was 51,000 taels of silver. For an ordinary family, this was a fortune that could never be spent in a lifetime. To be honest, it was an staggering amount. In the city, spending 100 taels a year is considered a very comfortable life. When Shin Jianchuan handed over the notes, Su Ran hadn't actually expected him to calculate the interest, let alone at such a generous rate of 50 taels per year. Although she had kept talking about collecting the debt, 1,000 taels was a mere drop in the bucket for the current Su Ran. However, 50,000 taels was a different story. After accepting the money, she asked if the courtyards of Shinji and Shinjuwu had been preserved. Shin Jianchuan quickly began to explain the situation. A little later, he led her toward what he claimed was the site. But when Shin Jianchuan brought her into a luxurious courtyard, Su Ran's face was a mask of utter disbelief. This courtyard was indeed more modest than the surrounding buildings, but it was absolutely not the place where Shinji had lived. Shin Jianchuan began to explain that over the centuries, many things had changed within the estate. Su Ran's face was a mask of pure disdain as she looked around. Really? Did they think she wouldn't notice? The place where Shinji actually lived was a tiny courtyard with only 2 main rooms and a single side room. She suspected the Shin family only upgraded this place after they learned he had become a top disciple of the Tianzhao sect. Su Ran strolled around with her hands behind her back, noting that there were absolutely no signs of anyone actually living here. It seemed that after leaving the Tianzhao sect, Shinji never once returned to the Shin family estate to stay. But if his relationship with the family was so strained, why on earth would he leave a note on their front gate? Was it just to let others know he owed her money? To be honest, she realized she didn't understand Shinji at all. After looking away, Su Ran decided it was time to visit the courtyard where Shinjiwu once resided. Shinjiwu was the illegitimate daughter of the family head, brought back at age 5 to become the 5th young lady. However, because of her birth, she remained an outcast even within her own home, never receiving any true affection. In Shin Jianchuan's memory, Sister Wu was a very quiet person who barely spoke, often bullied even by the servants. He recalled crossing paths with her a few times and even scolding the servants in her courtyard for their behavior. As Shin Jianchuan shared his impressions, we learned that Sister Wu possessed the rare dual affinity of water and fire. Usually, such clashing elements result in a frail body, making cultivation an incredibly difficult and painful path. Most people in that situation would simply abandon one element to focus entirely on either water or fire techniques. At first, Sister Wu did exactly that, choosing water techniques just to barely scrape her way into the Tianzhao sect. But even there, her older siblings continued to torment her. At the time, Shin Jianchuan was only 7 years old. He could only catch occasional snippets of news about her through the gossip of the household servants. That was until the sect competition 5 years ago, where she revealed her dual cultivation and defeated everyone in her path. Yet her older brothers still tried to bully her, only to meet a gruesome end where not even their bodies remained whole. After hearing about Shinjuwu's past, Su Ran couldn't help but feel that this was the classic setup for a powerful female lead story. But in reality, the main plot of this novel had actually begun during the previous generation. The affairs of the cultivation world were merely an appetizer for her, as Shin Jianchuan noted with a heavy sigh. Speaking of which, Sister Wu was truly formidable. It took the venerable Shinji 8 long years to fight his way into the demon den. She, however, only needed 3 days. Su Ran was quite surprised to hear this, as in her eyes, Shinji had always been someone who wanted his name to go down in history. Why would it take him 8 years to breach that place? Still, now that she had her money back and nothing better to do, she thought she might as well visit an old friend in the demon den. Shinji's body had never been recovered. The sect leader of Tianzhao once tried to retrieve his remains, but he was repelled by the backlash of the demonic artifacts. Thus, Shinji's body remained trapped within the demon den. After staying in Longyu City for 3 days, Su Ran packed her things and prepared to set out once more. When Shin Jianchuan realized she intended to go to the demon den, he immediately tried to stop her, calling out to his senior. He warned her that the den was currently a chaotic mess of demonic energy, where even nascent soul cultivators would be corroded. That place is forbidden, he urged, noting that Shinji's body had already been abandoned there for 1,000 years. Bringing him back was impossible now, but Su Ran simply waved her hand, saying she just wanted to take a look. Even if she couldn't get in, Shin Jianchuan remained uneasy and insisted on accompanying her on the journey. He admitted his cultivation was low and he might be a burden, but as she was Shinji's friend, he felt a duty to go. As a descendant of the Shin family, he couldn't let her face such danger alone. Su Ran couldn't help but smile at his earnestness. She told him to stay and focus on his training instead. To be honest, she admitted she had absolutely no sense of time. If he followed her, she joked that if she got even slightly distracted, he might end up in a coffin before he knew it. Hearing this, Shin Jianchuan let out a sudden burst of laughter, which left Su Ran looking a bit puzzled. She wondered what was so funny about her warning, though she knew she had lived a very long time. Shin Jianchuan, however, still found it difficult to adjust to the sight of the woman standing before him. Su Ran looked even younger than he did, making it all too easy to mistake her for a junior. Besides, the idea of him becoming a white-bearded old man was still decades away. Su Ran was no stranger to such thoughts. She had seen the same look in the eyes of villagers at the foot of the mountains. To be honest, the difference between her and ordinary people wasn't just a matter of lifespan. It was the weight of responsibility and the nature of desire. She knew that immortality could be a painful burden. She only wanted to do things that brought her joy as she left Longyu City, watched by Shin Jianchuan. Just as she had arrived quietly, her departure went unnoticed by the world at large. As her figure vanished into the crowd, Shin Jianchuan wondered how his ancestor had treated her 1,000 years ago. Imagine being generous enough to lend 1,000 silver taels, yet waiting a millennium to visit a friend's grave. She only remembered to check on him long after he had passed away. Shin Jianchuan felt he didn't understand this woman at all, and he wondered if the venerable Shinji ever truly did. Passing by a shop, Su Ran bought 2 roast chickens and tucked them away in her little candle pavilion. 1,000 years had passed, and she wasn't sure if Shinji still had a taste for roast chicken. Back then, he was always stealing her food, and despite being a lightweight, he insisted on drinking. He would eat and sing dramatic operas, boasting about how he would one day make a name for himself. Su Ran looked back at the city gates, where the emblem of Shinji's sword was still proudly displayed. It seemed Shinji had indeed become a legend in the cultivation world, just as he had promised. He had become the pillar of strength against the demon race, a thought she carried as she left the city. She carefully placed the 2 roast chickens she had bought into her spatial storage, ready to pay her respects to an old friend. Naturally, she wanted to bring him something from his hometown, and as evening approached, Su Ran arrived at a small town. The town appeared remarkably quiet, with almost no one on the streets, and even the few people passing by seemed off. They looked completely drained of energy, and after a few curious glances, Su Ran made her way toward the local inn. The waiter at the inn managed to stand up and greet her when he saw her enter. However, he was yawning incessantly, looking as if he hadn't slept in days, and Su Ran couldn't help but notice his exhaustion. She felt as if the man might fall asleep at any second, so she simply asked for a room and headed upstairs as night fell. And here we see a strange shift, as Su Ran noticed the town suddenly coming to life. She sat by her window, watching. Looking at the bustling streets, she felt a bit surprised. She wondered what kind of strange time zone this town was living in. It explained why everyone was so listless during the day, and even the waiter downstairs seemed to have found his second wind. After introducing the menu to Su Ran, he began to explain the peculiar situation of their little town. Apparently, the townspeople had been this way for a year, but since their health remained fine, no one was truly worried. Though they lacked energy during the day, it didn't stop them from working, and whatever they missed, they simply finished at night. They would try to sleep in the late hours of the night, but to be honest, very few people actually managed to drift off. This led to everyone being exhausted by day, yet the moment the sun went down, they were all wide awake and full of life. Su Ran took a slow sip of her tea and nodded. She found the situation surprisingly easy to understand. While this might seem bizarre to people of ancient times, for those in the modern world, this is a perfect perfectly ordinary Tuesday. The waiter hadn't expected Su Ran to accept the explanation so readily, which was a bit of a surprise for him. He added that if she didn't feel like sleeping at night, she shouldn't worry about it at all. It wouldn't harm her health, and because of this strange phenomenon, their town had actually become quite famous for its night market. As the night market outside grew lively, Su Ran told the waiter she was fine and let him leave the room. She was well aware that this little town was far from ordinary, and something felt quite off. The mayor had already consulted the Tianzhou sect, but even their experts couldn't explain the cause of the phenomenon. Since it didn't seem to harm anyone's health, Su Ran decided not to interfere. She was, after all, just passing through. However, when she woke up in the middle of the night, she saw a woman in white sitting in the sky, playing a zither. The music was loud and strangely exhilarating, yet the people on the streets below didn't seem to hear a thing. They couldn't see the woman either, so Su Ran leaned on her windowsill, resting her chin as she watched the performance. Although the woman was suppressing her aura, Su Ran could tell at a single glance that she wasn't human at all. She called out, asking why the spirit was forcing the townspeople to live such a backward, nocturnal lifestyle. Even if they had grown used to it, chronic sleep deprivation is a miserable experience that shouldn't be ignored. One cannot simply pretend nothing is wrong just because it has become a habit. And most importantly, disturbing the peace is a truly annoying habit, especially when someone is trying to enjoy a deep sleep. The spirit, a succubus, was stunned when Su Ran spoke to her, realizing the girl could actually see her. She was even more surprised to realize that Su Ran's voice was directed only at her ears. She wondered if this person was truly just a simple cultivator at the chi refining stage as she appeared. With that thought, the succubus teleported instantly, appearing directly in front of Su Ran's face. Her beautiful face twisted into a monstrous, gaping maw, looking as if she intended to swallow Su Ran whole. Su Ran simply reached out and pinched the creature's mouth shut, forcing her back into her original form. She dryly asked if the spirit had forgotten to brush her teeth, a comment that turned the succubus's face bright red. Enraged, the spirit swung her zither like a club. This instrument was a weapon, and it was meant to kill. With a quick wave of her hand, Su Ran summoned the cleaver from her bamboo basket to block the zither, noting how truly frightening the spirit was. As she spoke, Su Ran climbed out of the window. To be honest, if this succubus hadn't woken her up, she wouldn't be here at all. She had no desire to meddle in other people's business, considering herself to be a slightly selfish person by nature. Su Ran was the type who would happily watch a fire from across the river, so long as her own interests weren't at stake. Seeing her attack blocked so easily, the succubus realized she had finally run into someone who was a genuine threat. The spirit asked if she truly didn't care about the lives of the townspeople, but Su Ran wasn't falling for that tired routine. She pointed out that if the succubus could have killed these people, she would have done so long ago instead of waiting until now. Su Ran knew that if she showed concern for the villagers, the spirit would only use it against her, and most importantly, she wasn't acting for the sake of these strangers. She was only involved because the succubus had personally provoked her. In fact, she had been perfectly willing to just have a quick chat with the spirit and then be on her way. But since the succubus had tried to devour her the moment they met, Su Ran found herself growing increasingly annoyed. Her strikes became more aggressive, and the succubus, unable to dodge in time, felt the sting of a counterattack. A wound instantly appeared on the spirit's neck, and a look of pure shock flashed across her face. Having lived for over 1,000 years as an immortal member of the demon race, this was actually the first time she had ever been hurt. The pain only enraged the succubus, who used a spell to knock the cleaver right out of Su Ran's hand. But just as she prepared to strike back, she caught a heavy punch directly to the face. In that instant, it felt as if her entire right cheek had shattered, and she was sent flying backward through the air. Su Ran watched the flying succubus and shook out her hand, offering a mock apology for using the cleaver earlier. She admitted that she was actually much better at using her fists. She then leaped onto the roof, shading her eyes with her hand. Looking in the direction the succubus had vanished, she decided that since she had started this, she might as well finish it for good. She knew the importance of finishing what she started, but by the time Su Ran finally woke up the next morning, there was already a persistent knocking at her door. The waiter cautiously asked if the guest was awake, explaining that 2 cultivators wished to see her. These were disciples from the Tianzhou sect, who had sensed a demonic artifact in the town last night and rushed over to investigate the situation. And if one were looking for anything unusual in this town, a new guest arriving just yesterday certainly fit the bill. Usually, visitors to this town suffered from the same sleeplessness as the locals, but this guest had slept perfectly normally, which, naturally, made her seem a bit suspicious. Su Ran pulled open the door to find 2 young Tianzhou sect disciples, a boy and a girl, both around 18. She glanced at them and asked what they wanted, causing the 2 disciples to exchange a quick look. They began to think they might have been mistaken, although this woman wasn't an ordinary person. She appeared to be a mere chi refiner. Consequently, they only asked a few routine questions. Su Ran, of course, played the part of the clueless traveler, claiming she had been asleep the whole time. Realizing they wouldn't get any answers, and seeing the town's abnormalities had vanished, they stopped their questioning. They decided to return to their sect to report, while Su Ran chose not to leave in a hurry. Leaving right after an interrogation would look suspicious, so she waited 2 hours, until she saw a familiar face. The 2 of them stared at each other in surprise, yet they both had the sense to pretend they were strangers. Shen Jianchuan certainly hadn't expected to run into senior Su Ran again, but he knew she preferred to stay low profile. So, after a brief moment of eye contact, Shen Jianchuan simply looked away. The Tianzhou sect elder had brought him along for experience, even though he wasn't the elder's direct disciple. He was treated no differently than the elite disciples, especially since the Shen family excelled at alchemy. Regarding the situation in this town, one had to consider the possibility of poisoning, so Su Ran sat by the inn's entrance. We see her watching Shen Jianchuan as he checked the pulses of the townspeople, while nearby, several women gathered together. They were busy discussing the strange events of the previous night with hushed, anxious voices. One woman nodded in agreement, admitting that while those words had come from her own mouth, she felt as though she hadn't been the one speaking. She hadn't noticed it before, but waking up today felt entirely different. Su Ran observed the expressions of relief on their faces, the look of people who had narrowly escaped a disaster. She felt a slight stir of emotion, realizing that a problem she had solved so casually had actually helped so many people. As night fell, Shen Jianchuan quietly went to find Su Ran, hoping to ask about the demon that had been in the town. But just as he was about to knock, a message appeared. If you have business, input spiritual power. If not, please leave. Shen Jianchuan looked at the text with a touch of helplessness. After all, who would come here if they didn't have business? Nevertheless, he obediently did as he was told and channeled his spiritual power into the glowing words. He stared at the new text that appeared while trying to peer into the room, curious about what was happening inside. From what he could sense, the person inside the room was indeed fast asleep and completely undisturbed. It was clear that senior Su Ran knew someone would come looking for her at night, so she had left this message intentionally. He wasn't sure if this spiritual energy would actually answer him, but he decided to leave his questions behind anyway. In less than an instant, a new set of words began to float right in front of his eyes. Shen Jianchuan watched the text form, feeling a wave of shock. His senior was still sound asleep, yet the spiritual power she had set up acted just like the woman herself, capable of answering his specific questions. And so, Shen Jianchuan began to amuse himself at the door, asking, "Senior, what exactly is this?" Wondering how it could possibly answer him, he continued to feed his questions into the door using his spiritual power. An answer appeared almost instantly, and Shen Jianchuan found himself staring intently at those 4 specific words. He recognized every single character individually, yet somehow, he couldn't quite grasp what they meant when put together. But this small interaction confirmed one thing for Shen Jianchuan. Senior Su Ran's power was far beyond the chi refining stage. He even wondered if she had descended from the upper realms. Meanwhile, the next morning, Su Ran finally woke up. She immediately sensed that someone had triggered her automatic reply system during the night, so she opened the logs. To her surprise, there were over 100 entries, all of them questions from that young boy, Shen Jianchuan. Su Ran clicked on the recorded footage to take a look. The first 3 minutes minutes were serious inquiries about the situation. However, the following 5 minutes were just him playing around at her door in the middle of the night because he found it amusing. Su Ran closed the chat logs and got out of bed, noting that the Tianzhou sect had sent quite a few people over. After all, clearing the demonic energy from the minds of every single townsperson was a massive undertaking. Su Ran originally intended to leave since her work was done, but unexpectedly, the members of the Tianzhou sect arrived. They insisted on helping her clear any demonic energy as well, and seeing their guilty expressions, she found it hard to refuse. In truth, the town's troubles weren't the sect's fault, yet even though they weren't related to these people, they felt responsible. Once the treatment was finished, the young disciple from the sect quietly left the room. Su Ran stood up and leaned against the doorway, watching as the girl moved on to help the next person clear their energy. This entire process consumed a significant amount of spiritual power. It seems joining a sect requires a true spirit of sacrifice. Su Ran was certain she couldn't do it. Who would risk their life just for a job? Certainly not her, at least. By noon, Su Ran checked out and prepared to depart, while the waiter saw her to the door with a bright smile. The staff likely didn't realize this guest was the reason they could return to their normal lives, but they were grateful regardless. Ever since she had checked into the inn, everything had taken a turn for the better, starting with a good night's sleep. The waiter was more than happy to work diligently during the day, and Su Ran watched as he politely escorted her out. She couldn't help but tease him a little, and upon hearing her words, the waiter gave a small, sheepish laugh. He looked a bit embarrassed, to be honest, scratching his head with a humble grin. Su Ran didn't reply. She simply wondered if this waiter would still be working at the same in the next time she visited. Before Shin Jianchuan prepared to return to his sect, he went to find Su Ran once more, but he arrived a moment too late. Su Ran had already departed, and the waiter never imagined that the young master of the Shin family would be looking for that particular guest. She left about half an hour ago, the waiter explained, asking if there was a problem, but Shin Jianchuan simply dismissed it. He waved his hand dismissively, but despite his casual words, he immediately began walking toward the exit. He wasn't sure how far his senior had traveled in half an hour, so he hurried toward the northern edge of town to catch up. But after only a few steps, we see him spot Su Ran, who was casually crouching by the roadside playing with a dog. Seeing Shin Jianchuan rushing toward her in such a hurry, Su Ran simply patted her hands clean and stood up. "Senior, I've truly troubled you this time," Shin Jianchuan said, clasping his hands and bowing deeply to show his gratitude. With a casual wave of her hand, a soft glow descended and landed directly in front of Shin Jianchuan. She admitted that she didn't actually know much about the specific matters regarding Shinji. Back then, he was a personal disciple of Qingxuan, the leader of the Tianzhou sect, a position of great prestige. She, on the other hand, was merely an outer disciple responsible for cleaning the back mountains. Their paths rarely crossed. After leaving the sect due to her lack of talent, or so she claimed, she had almost never seen him again. These are the words Shinji spoke to her, but since there were too many to read, she had simply made a copy of them. She told him to take his time reading it, and Shin Jianchuan felt a surge of excitement as he looked at the spiritual pages in his hand. This was something belonging to the Venerable Ji, the very person he admired most, and he thanked her with all his heart. As soon as Shin Jianchuan saw Su Ran off, he immediately summoned a sect carriage and began his journey back home. We see Su Ran standing by the roadside, gazing toward the Tianzhou sect before turning away to continue her walk. As she walked, she flipped through the chat logs Shinji had left behind, which were, quite frankly, mostly nonsense. One entry mentioned a shop in Qingshui town with roast chicken so delicious it rivaled her own cooking. He suggested she try it if she ever passed by, and Su Ran glanced at her own reply from long ago. She had written that she might try it when she wasn't so busy, a message sent over 1,000 years ago. That was during her second year after leaving the sect, but now that 10 centuries had passed, things were different. After all, who could possibly know where Qingshui town even was anymore? Su Ran felt her artificial intelligence reply system was still lacking and decided it definitely needed an upgrade. She wanted to include timestamps and locations for messages, which would make finding people much easier. Now, Su Ran was the type of person who acted quickly. Once she had an idea, she wouldn't let it sit idle. That evening, after finding a bridge to camp under, she began working on improving her AI reply system. She wanted to record the user's location in real time, but in this world, there were no satellites to be found. Without real-time positioning, she realized she would simply have to build a spiritual power satellite of her own. With that thought in mind, Su Ran began combining formations to create a spell that could act like a satellite. It would need to orbit high above the entire cultivation world, though that presented a slight problem. Objects imbued with magic are easily detected when they pass over the airspace of various powerful sects. To avoid this, she needed a concealment spell, which, unfortunately, was not her area of expertise. And so, Su Ran's scientific research hit a bit of a wall simply because she couldn't hide her work. She sighed and stuffed the half-finished formation into her storage space, deciding to leave it for another day. But just then, she sensed a trace of demonic energy, and the realization hit her almost immediately. This was the energy left behind by that succubus after her death, lingering in the air to prevent any chance of escape. Su Ran gathered every scrap of that energy and stuffed it into her storage space, because she was certain of one thing. The most airtight, inescapable place in this entire world was her own personal dimension. Su Ran had considered the possibility that the succubus might have faked her death, perhaps by vanishing as a wisp of smoke. Or maybe she intended to reform her body through cultivation later, but seeing the energy darting around her space confirmed it. She knew all those years of watching anime hadn't been for nothing. This succubus was definitely still alive. The way the energy scurried about in a panic the moment it sensed her presence was a bit of a dead giveaway. Su Ran entered her space, snatched the frantic cloud of energy, and squeezed it back into a tiny human shape. She told the creature to start talking, as she knew it was alive, and the little figure wobbled before her. It finally stopped and spoke, claiming it had truly died and dissipated until Su Ran gathered the pieces back together. It explained that being placed in such a spiritual environment had only just woken it up, and Su Ran stared, unconvinced. The succubus immediately began to swear an oath, begging for mercy and claiming she had never killed a single soul. She vowed to vanish from existence if she were lying, and Su Ran, somewhat reluctantly, decided to believe her. After all, the art of concealment and illusion is easily ruined by the scent of blood. She then asked for the creature's name. The creature replied that her name was Haisheng, the Hai from the word for ocean and Sheng for sacred. Su Ran then asked if she was as good at concealment as she was at illusions, noting that Haisheng's skills were indeed impressive. To be honest, Su Ran hadn't sensed her at all until the demon chose to reveal herself. Haisheng grew quite proud. She began to boast, claiming that even the demon king himself had praised her talents in the past. However, the moment the words left her mouth, she was met with a swift smack, as Su Ran herself lacked such skills. Now that she had an expert like Haisheng on her side, her plan could finally be put into motion. It was as if someone had handed her a pillow just as she was falling asleep, proof that good deeds really do pay off. Once Su Ran confirmed that Haisheng's techniques were effective, she instructed her to apply a concealment spell to the satellite she was researching. Haisheng spread her hands helplessly, explaining that in her current state, she couldn't even cast the simplest spell, let alone concealment. She claimed it was a miracle she was even alive, which prompted Su Ran to ask exactly how long her recovery would take. Su Ran understood that since the demon had just been revived, she needed time to cultivate again, and she wasn't in any particular rush. Haisheng sat cross-legged inside, noting it could take 3 to 5 years, or perhaps 3 to 500. She couldn't be sure. She suggested that if Su Ran were to let her out, she could probably regain her strength in just a few years. But if Su Ran kept her locked away, forced to rely solely on spiritual energy, it would likely take centuries. Su Ran didn't say a word. She simply stared at her until Haisheng's back began to tingle with unease. I am a demon, Haisheng reminded her. She explained that she needed demonic energy to cultivate, and if she could return to the northern demon city, she'd recover in 6 months. However, she noted that no cultivator in the current world could enter that city. Su Ran continued to watch her silently. Deep down, she knew exactly what the demon was thinking, as this entire space was her own personal creation. creation. The thoughts of every living creature here were laid bare before her eyes, and Haixing was certainly no exception. In fact, Haixing only existed because of Su Ran's own spiritual energy, so she let the demon ramble on with her fantasies. By listening to Haixing's thoughts, she could learn much more about the demon race. Finally, Su Ran made her a proposal. She told Haixing she could go to the demon city, provided they signed a formal labor contract first. After all, she wasn't a heartless boss. Once the spiritual energy satellite was operational, Haixing would no longer be needed. Haixing tilted her head in confusion at the mention of a contract, having no idea what such a thing even was. With a simple wave of her hand, Su Ran manifested 2 sheets of paper made entirely of shimmering spiritual energy. We see her present 2 copies of the agreement to avoid any future disputes, promising to send Haixing to the demon city to recover. In exchange, the demon would be responsible for applying the strongest concealment spells to her spiritual energy satellite, a deal Haixing hadn't expected. The demon thought this young girl was surprisingly kind for offering a trip back home, but Su Ran had her own reasons. To be honest, Su Ran was surprised by how casually Haixing signed, without even glancing at the compensation clauses for breaking the contract. With a flick of her finger, Su Ran revealed the penalty section, suggesting that Haixing might want to turn the page and keep reading. It stated quite clearly that if either party failed to fulfill their duties, they would simply cease to exist on the spot. Haixing didn't seem to care at all, waving it off as if the strongest concealment spell in existence was a mere trifle. She promised to handle it personally, while Su Ran watched the succubus, realizing just how easy she was to manage. When Su Ran specified that the strongest spell, she didn't mean it was a one-time deal, as Haixing's cultivation grew, so would her power. This meant the demon would be required to constantly upgrade the satellite's concealment as she herself became stronger. It was, in essence, a lifetime of service, and Su Ran handed over a copy of the contract for the demon to keep. As for the deadline for completing these tasks, both the human and the demon reached a silent, mutual understanding to never mention it. Su Ran knew she would live for a very long time, and her spiritual satellites would undoubtedly go through many iterations. Naturally, she would always need Haixing's magic, so setting an expiration date was out of the question. Haixing, meanwhile, assumed that no human could outlive a demon, and if Su Ran met an untimely end, the contract would vanish. To a demon, a century is but a blink of an eye, so she felt no pressure regarding the passage of time. And so, these 2 beings, neither concerned with the ticking of a clock, tacitly ignored the lack of a time frame in their agreement. As long as they both remained among the living, the contract would remain in effect. Later, Su Ran emerged from her private space. She leaned against a platform of spiritual energy, watching the fish in the river and wondering where exactly Qingshui town was located. She wondered if the roast chicken there was truly as delicious as they said, and at dawn the next day, she prepared to set out. She asked everyone she met where Qingshui town was, but many people simply shook their heads, having never even heard of the place. This put Su Ran in a bit of a difficult position, as it seemed no one knew the location of this mysterious town. While passing through a village along the way, we see Su Ran spot an old woman sitting on a stone beneath the shade of a tree. She went over to sit beside her, and the old woman proved to be quite warm, though she spoke in a dialect that was difficult to understand. The woman told her that the people living there had all moved from somewhere else a very long time ago. Back then, a demon general had descended from the sky, and in an instant, an entire village was slaughtered until only a dozen people remained. But nobody believed it. In the village today, no one listens to those stories, so Su Ran lowered her voice to ask a question. She asked how the woman could possibly know if it happened so long ago, and the old woman replied that she had seen it in a dream. She claimed she was only 15 or 16 at the time, dreaming of a sky filled with fire and fields covered in the bodies of the dead. As Magu spoke, she became increasingly agitated, eventually clutching her head and weeping loudly, a sight that clearly troubled Su Ran. She immediately used her spiritual energy to soothe her, and after a few moments, Magu finally began to calm down. In fact, she seemed even more lucid than usual, though she looked at Su Ran with a start of surprise. It seemed she hadn't expected to find herself sitting there, and she cast a confused, questioning look towards Su Ran. Without a word, she stood up and walked away, while Su Ran watched her retreating figure until Magu vanished at the village entrance. Only then did she look away, uncertain if Magu's words were true and frustrated that she hadn't managed to ask what she really wanted. After a moment of reflection, Su Ran shouldered her bamboo basket, deciding she would try to find someone else to ask. At the very least, she wanted to find out where the people of this village had originally migrated from. After thinking it over, Su Ran decided to seek out the village chief, asking some children by the road to lead her to his house. The children were quite cheerful, mentioning that they had just seen Su Ran talking with Grandma Magu. Apparently, she was the very first person who had ever been able to actually have a conversation with her. Su Ran smiled warmly, gently taking the hand of one of the little girls as they walked together. We listen along with her as they chatter away about their lives until they finally reach the village chief's house. To thank them for their help, Su Ran pulled out a bag of candy and began distributing it among the children. Just then, a woman in her 30s stepped out from the main gate, glancing over before calling out to the children. Fearing a misunderstanding, Su Ran quickly began to explain her presence to the woman. Seeing Su Ran's polite demeanor, the woman's expression softened as she looked toward the children. One of the little girls spoke up in her defense, insisting that Su Ran was a good person. She explained that they had seen her chatting with Grandma Magu earlier, and since she was looking for the chief, they had helped her. So we brought her here, the girl added, clutching her candy as she finished her explanation. Once the village chief understood Su Ran's intent, he sent the children off to play and invited her into the courtyard. The chief's home appeared quite prosperous, with a courtyard that was both tidy and elegantly maintained. Flowers lined both sides of the stone path, and once they were seated, the chief turned to Su Ran with a question. He asked what she needed from him, and Su Ran, choosing not to hide her intentions, asked her question directly. To be honest, the chief hadn't expected this young woman to be so curious about the origins of their village. It was an unusual request, especially since the migration had happened so very long ago. He admitted that since nearly 1,000 years had passed, he wasn't entirely clear on the details of the past himself. Perhaps you will find answers in the chief's records, he noted, but first, you must tell me something. He wanted to know why she was so interested in the village's predecessor, and Su Ran answered him honestly. She explained that she was searching for a place called Qingshui town, a town that had also existed 1,000 years ago. She was simply hoping for a clue, but the moment the chief heard the name, Qingshui town, his expression shifted. A flicker of confusion crossed his face as the name sounded strangely familiar, and after a moment of thought, the chief spoke. He mentioned that those old records hadn't been organized in quite a long time, which was a bit of a problem. If Su Ran truly wanted to know about the village's past, he told her she was welcome to look through them herself. Of course, there was a small catch. She would have to help organize and preserve them while she read. A fair trade, really. Su Ran couldn't help but feel that her fate in this cultivation world was simply to be a perpetual worker bee. She hadn't expected that after working 1,000 years ago, she'd still be doing chores 1,000 years later. Taking a seat on a chair from her storage space, she began to flip through the journals of the very first village chief. The records described how their original town had been brutally massacred by a demon general serving under the demon king. The reason for the slaughter was simple. Their town had once provided aid to a certain immortal cultivator, and that cultivator happened to be the one who had stabbed the demon king. At this, Su Ran felt a sudden, sinking striking premonition. She almost hesitated to turn the page, wondering who else could have stabbed the demon king 1,000 years ago besides Shinji. It seemed these townspeople had suffered the demon's wrath solely because they had chosen to help him. She worried they might have grown to hate Shinji for it, but as she turned the page, the next sentence caught her off guard. A look of genuine shock appeared on Su Ran's face as she read the very first line of the next entry. It stated that future generations must not blame Master Shinji, for it was the demons, not him, who had murdered their kin. Even without Shinji's involvement, the demon race would have continued to slaughter the innocent regardless. Su Ran felt a bit humbled by their grace, realizing her own perspective might have been far narrower than theirs. She imagined being in their shoes, if her own family had been killed because of someone they had once saved. She wasn't entirely sure she could have avoided resenting that person. To be honest, few people could. As she read further, she learned that many other towns had been targeted, and several neighboring villages had been completely wiped out. As for the dozen or so survivors from their town, it turns out they owed their lives entirely to Shinji. If it hadn't been for a protective array he left behind, not a single one of them would have escaped that day. In reality, that array was merely a rumor he had set in motion, yet it carried such immense spiritual power that it successfully repelled the demon attack. Their survival, we see, was a direct gift from Master Shinji. The records insisted that his message must be passed down through generations, hoping he might one day hear it. Su Ran flipped the page, but when she saw the actual message, a drop of sweat practically rolled down her neck. It was indeed meant for her, reading, Su Ran, I've gone to the Yangming heavens. The message continued, remember to come eat roast chicken, it's delicious. Was that really worth preserving for centuries? Su Ran felt a wave of helplessness. The town was long gone, so where on earth was he supposed to find this chicken? Still, she realized that she was likely the only person in this entire world who could actually decipher it. It was written in the Martian script she had once taught Shinji. She then checked the notes of later village chiefs. She found the content was identical. Aside from that one message, the rest were just warnings to the descendants. They were told they must remember these words forever. Just then, the current village chief stepped back inside. By now, Su Ran had reached the records from his grandfather's era. He asked if she could read the founder's notes. He explained that because the language had evolved, they could no longer understand the ancient script. She told him she could. Su Ran didn't try to hide the truth from the chief and read the contents of the journals aloud for him. The chief pointed specifically at the Martian script and asked her what that particular line meant, as it looked so different. With a slightly awkward expression, Su Ran lied, claiming it was likely a secret code she couldn't quite decipher. The chief glanced at her but didn't press for details. He noted that the founder's original intentions aligned perfectly with their own, but that was all in the past. There was no use dwelling on the village's history now. The village chief pondered for a moment, concluding that dwelling on why the village was gone served no purpose now. Even so, he still wanted to ask Su Ran about Magu's condition, wondering if she could actually cure her. He explained that when Magu was younger, she had moments of clarity. When the episodes weren't hitting, she was quite kind. If it were possible, the chief simply wanted Magu to live out her final days with a clear and peaceful mind. Su Ran hadn't expected the chief to ask for her help in treating Magu's specific affliction. To be honest, Magu's illness was less of a physical ailment and more of a lingering inner demon. Despite living 1,000 years later, she constantly dreamed of the village's destruction from a millennium ago. The world back then was entirely different, we see, with the human race facing daily onslaughts from the demons. One could never be sure if they would wake up the next morning. Back then, as a sect worker, Su Ran was incredibly busy. While the inner disciples handled the actual combat, her outer sect group was responsible for the grim task of cleaning up. Naturally, she had seen far too many tragedies, but for an ordinary teenager living a simple life like Magu, dreaming of such horrors was understandably terrifying. Su Ran finally gave her professional assessment. She could treat her by sealing away the frightening memories, but she strongly advised against taking that path. If the inner demon was too strong, the seal would eventually loosen, and she would be forced to remember everything again. Reliving those traumatic memories could potentially make her mental state even worse than it was now. She suggested that simply having someone to accompany her more often would be the best medicine. After saying this, Su Ran pulled out a small bottle of pills and handed them over to the village chief. Taking one every 3 days would help stabilize her spirit. Su Ran then sat down to write a formal letter. She told him that if he truly wanted a full cure, he should take Magu to the Shin family in Longyu City. If they showed this letter to the young master, he would help. Hearing this, the chief's respect for her grew immensely. Thank you, Immortal, the chief said with deep gratitude. Since this village was the successor to Qingshui town, Su Ran decided to ask him a question. She wanted to know exactly where the old site of the original town was located. The chief thought for a moment, and ultimately decided to hand over the ancient map of the region to Su Ran. This map had been preserved by every village chief through the generations, a precious relic from the very first leader. The locations marked upon it, we see, were likely the true foundations of where the old town once stood. Su Ran accepted the map happily, noting it was exactly what she needed. But as she stepped out of the chief's house, a young woman suddenly rushed toward them. The moment the chief saw her, he knew exactly what kind of trouble was coming. Huichio, what kind of nonsense are you up to now? He barked, but the girl's eyes were already shining with longing. She ignored him, pleading, Chief, I heard an immortal has arrived and is heading north. I want to travel with her. That way, my parents won't have to worry about my safety anymore. Su Ran watched the two of them go back and forth, quickly piecing together what Huichio was actually planning. It turned out that Magu was actually Huichio's great aunt. 3 years ago, Huichio had learned a secret from her. She had discovered that their ancestors had all migrated here from the distant northern territory. Driven by curiosity, the 15-year-old girl had tried to sneak north, only to be nearly killed by demonic beasts. For the past 2 years, she had been confined to her home, recovering from those lingering old wounds. Now that she could finally leave her bed, she still refused to give up on the north, persisting despite the risks. Naturally, Su Ran had no desire to bring a mortal along on her journey. However, she knew that if she left her behind, the girl would likely just run off toward the north on her own again. Last time, she was lucky enough to find a cultivator. If no one looked after her this time, she might truly lose her life. Su Ran raised her hand to interrupt their bickering. I have a compromise, she said calmly. I wonder if young Huichio would be willing to listen to my proposal. Huichio and the chief both turned to look at Su Ran as she confirmed her destination was indeed the northern territory. She suggested that if young Huichio was willing, she could send messages back, or even show her what the north looked like. How exactly would I see it? Huichio asked, looking completely dazed by the suggestion. Su Ran pulled out a small metal bowl and asked if they had a mirror, noting that a mirror would work even better. To be honest, Su Ran felt a bit embarrassed, as this was just a little gadget she had cobbled together on a whim long ago. She had never really intended to use it to communicate with mortals, so she hadn't bothered to update it since then. The version she held was 800 years old, but we see it was still more than enough to transmit a few images. It functioned much like a modern video call, though she rarely had a reason to use such a thing over the years. Even with her friend uncle living nearby, he could usually walk over and sit on her porch faster than the connection would start. Huichio hurried to find a bronze mirror from the house, and Su Ran immediately began tinkering with it. The chief and the girl watched as the young immortal drew strange symbols, chuckling to herself as she worked. She looked quite focused, and once she finished, Huichio accepted the mirror with great solemnity. The girl returned the small bowl, and Su Ran gently warned her that her progress through the north might be quite slow. She told her not to worry, to live her life well, and to spend time with her great aunt. Huichio, of course, agreed. She could wait a year or two, even if it was slow. She hoped to see that place at least once before her life ended. She wanted to see the land that had caused her great aunt such nightmares. After that, Su Ran finally took her leave. Seeing the girl's lingering gaze, the chief reached out and patted her head, telling her not to overthink things. He told her to simply wait for the immortal's messages, knowing full well why she was so desperate to see Qingshui town. It was a deep-seated obsession. Those nightmares were no longer just Magu's burden to carry. They had begun to affect shocked Wuchio as well, and the chief felt truly grateful to the immortal for giving the girl a path forward. This way, the girl might avoid following Magu's tragic path. Realizing this, the chief suddenly remembered something important. He hadn't even asked the young immortal for her name, which prompted him to quickly open the letter she had left behind. He expected to find her name inside, but as he scanned the paper, his expression began to crumble in confusion. The note simply read, "Student Shen, help this person with their illness. I recommended them." The chief was nearly driven mad. Who could possibly understand such a vague message? He even wondered for a moment if they had been swindled by a fraud. He explained the situation to Wuchio, telling her about the immortal's referral for Magu's treatment to see what she thought. After thinking it over, Wuchio asked the chief to write a formal letter to accompany the immortal's cryptic note. They sent them off together, and by the evening of the fourth day, a sect carriage pulled up at the village entrance. Meanwhile, we returned to Su Ran, who had long since left the small village behind and continued her journey northward. As she stopped to rest for the night, she began to ask about the events of nearly 1,000 years ago. She wanted to know the identity of the demon general who led the attack on the humans, a general that sounded quite mad. She assumed such a person must be dead by now, but Hai Xing reacted instantly when he heard her mention Lord Kuei Ming. He immediately refuted the idea that Lord Kuei Ming was dead, insisting with great fervor that the Lord was still very much alive. Su Ran gave Hai Xing another light smack on the head before continuing her interrogation regarding this general named Kuei Ming. She was genuinely surprised the general had survived, having escaped both Shinji and Shinjuwu. Talk about incredible luck. She wondered if this person was some kind of chosen one. After all, in a story like this, a villainous male lead was unlikely. Then again, villainous male leads were quite popular lately. Su Ran tried her best to recall the author of the book she was in. She wondered if it was part of a series, but unfortunately, she couldn't find any memories of the author at all. Hai Xing watched her with a look of pure confusion as her eyes brightened one moment and she fell into deep thought the next. What exactly are you doing? He asked, while Su Ran simply sat there, thoughtfully stroking her chin. She asked if this Lord Kuei Ming was at least good-looking, assuming he must have some redeeming qualities. As it turns out, the demon race actually has quite high aesthetic standards. Even an ordinary, low-level demon tends to have very regular features. But of course, Lord Kuei Ming's beauty was on an entirely different level. Hai Xing spoke with such pride that he refused to admit anyone could compare, though he did have one exception. He recalled a cultivator who ascended 3 years ago whose beauty was truly breathtaking, even to a demon. He had rarely seen a human with such looks. Meanwhile, he thought to himself that the girl before him was quite plain. Unfortunately for him, Su Ran heard his inner thoughts. She knew she was average, but being judged by a faceless demon was a bit much to take. To be honest, she felt a very strong urge to hit him again. She rolled over and lay there for a moment until, suddenly, the distant sound of someone crying for help reached her ears. She immediately perked up, her ears straining to catch the direction of the commotion. Hai Xing's tone remained light and indifferent. He couldn't care less whether those cultivators lived or died. Ignoring his apathy, Su Ran left her space and squinted toward the source of the shouting. She threw on her small basket and sprinted over. Nearby, 3 people watched a demonic beast lunging at them, feeling as though they were already at death's door, until a figure blurred past and precisely knocked 4 beasts flying. She told herself she'd made it just in time for the loot. The 3 disciples collapsed, gasping for breath. When they finally regained their senses, they looked toward where the beasts had landed, but the savior was too fast. They couldn't even tell if their rescuer was human or some other creature. To knock 4 beasts away at once was a feat beyond their imagination. If this new arrival was an enemy, they might have been better off eaten. However, by the time they approached, the 4 demonic beasts had already been expertly gutted. The cores were gone, and one long-legged beast had even been stripped of its skin and limbs. Talk about efficiency. The mysterious figure had vanished without a trace, but they knew, with immense relief, that they had been saved. Dozens of miles away, Su Ran was crouching by a ditch to wash her hands, glad that she had moved so quickly. She knew those cultivators wouldn't dare approach her recklessly, even though they had already managed to wound the beasts. She had no intention of risking her life fighting them for the spoils, nor did she plan on sharing a single bit of her loot. After washing her hands, she suddenly sensed someone approaching and quickly ducked behind a tree to hide. Several sect disciples dressed in green robes flew past her in a blur. As she caught sight of their distinctive clothing, Su Ran immediately recognized their uniform. These were disciples from the Xianin sect. The Xianin sect specialized in wind-based techniques, making them experts in tracking and high-speed combat. She watched them head off and was about to leave, but then, she suddenly paused in her tracks. She turned and sprinted toward the direction where the disciples had vanished. She really did owe that sect, didn't she? Su Ran quickly overtook the Xianin disciples. Meanwhile, the 3 survivors were just beginning to catch their breath, when a powerful surge of demonic energy suddenly bore down on them, causing the wounded and weeping trio to tremble. They began to cough violently as the demonic aura started to corrode their dantians and meridians. The black mist gradually coalesced into a human form, a man with purple hair that fluttered as if caught in a phantom wind. He toyed with a black ring on his finger and asked coldly if they were the ones who had killed his pets. Just as the man was about to strike, a voice rang out, "You're wrong. It was me." Suddenly, a figure flashed forward, delivering a spinning kick that sent him flying backward through the air. Su Ran watched the true demon fly and gave chase instantly, before he could even process what was happening. She delivered another kick that slammed him hard against a mountain wall. To be honest, the demon never saw it coming. As a demon lord, he found it utterly impossible to believe that someone could attack him before he could even react. This was the first time he had ever taken 2 solid kicks to the face, and a strange smile curled on the true demon's lips. He let out a classic, overbearing villain's boast, remarking that he hadn't expected to find such an interesting character in the cultivation world. Su Ran couldn't help but ask Hai Shen, the demon in her head, if all demons were this particular brand of arrogant. Hai Shen sat cross-legged in her mind, and when Su Ran asked that, he felt a sudden, desperate urge to explain himself. He thought of the demon lord and those high-ranking generals, but for a moment, he found himself completely at a loss for words. He didn't know how to argue back. After all, the demon race had never truly bothered to take humans seriously before. Taking Hai Shen's silence as an answer, Su Ran realized the truth. Yes, apparently, all demons really were like this. She decided to ignore the true demon's chatter and followed up with a punch that shattered his arm instantly. The force sent him flying through the air. At that moment, Hai Shen finally got to see from a third-person perspective exactly what it looked like to be blasted away by one of her strikes. Her style was, to put it mildly, quite primitive. There was no refined technique or logic to it. Trying to fight her like a standard sect disciple was a massive mistake. Hai Shen noted that it was better to treat her like a wild beast. Listening to his inner thoughts, Su Ran felt a bead of sweat drop. She wondered if he could possibly find a more flattering comparison. A wild beast? Really? It wasn't that her attacks lacked logic by choice, but rather that she had never been taught the proper ways of the sects. As a mere outer disciple, she'd had to teach herself everything. To be honest, she never actually had the time to cultivate properly. Every day was spent cleaning up after the sect and tidying the courtyards, leaving her with no energy for traditional training. She even had to travel long distances just to collect the corpses of the more illustrious disciples who had fallen in battle. The only thing that kept her going each month was the meager silver she earned. And now, this demon was calling her a beast. Offended, Su Ran stepped forward and landed another heavy blow on the true demon. Meanwhile, Hai Shen had a sudden realization. He finally understood her greatest weakness. Su Ran had absolutely no idea how high-level demonic skills actually worked. Su Ran didn't seem to mind that Hai Shen had guessed her weakness. She truly hadn't had the time to study the demon race before. However, when it came to understanding demonic beasts, she was quite the expert, and so she continued her relentless assault on the true demon. She struck him again and again, refusing to give him a single moment to catch his breath or mount a counterattack. The blows kept coming, one after another, as she poured all her frustration into each heavy, unrefined impact. It was a brutal display of power, a continuous barrage that left the true demon reeling under the sheer weight of her strikes. As we've seen, Su Ran never had the luxury of time to research the complexities of high-level demons during her days at the sect. But her knowledge of demonic beasts was extensive. She felt she finally understood those ancient bestiaries she had read in her past life. She had even compiled a similar book of her own, recording various beast types and, more importantly, which parts were the most valuable. As for high-ranking demons, she had only received the most basic introductory training when she first entered the immortal sect. It seemed she would definitely need to brush up on the combat styles of high-level demons in the future to avoid being caught off guard. Since this true demon's avatar was now heavily injured, the main body would likely feel the effects of the damage as well. He probably wouldn't be showing his face around here again anytime soon. But that left one question. Why were disciples from the Xianing sect here? Su Ran knew they were nearly 3,000 miles deep into the Tianzhou region. The sect's territory should have been much further south. Curiosity getting the better of her, she sneakily headed back to check on those disciples, remembering that she was once one of them. She had even received kindness from an inner disciple back then, during her second year after being transported into the world of this book. It was the first time she had fallen ill, and she had been so sick that she could barely even crawl out of bed. An inner disciple had brought her medicine and used spiritual energy to help regulate her weakened body. When she recovered and tried to thank her, the senior sister simply smiled and said that as fellow disciples, helping was only natural. We return to the present, where the leading young woman rushes forward to help the three companions lying on the ground. The three of them were still incredibly weak from the ordeal, but fortunately, they had finally regained consciousness. Senior sister, we're all right, they managed to say, as the young woman looked around and saw only the three of them remaining. There is no need to wonder about the others. They are already gone. It was a lapse in my judgment. This was my mistake, she admitted, before instructing the others to take the three wounded disciples back to safety first. But senior sister, it's dangerous here. That powerful demonic energy we felt, it might have been a true demon. One of them spoke up, clearly worried about her staying behind after they had all felt that spine-chilling aura earlier. Even though it had vanished quickly, there was no telling if it might suddenly reappear when they least expected it. The young woman simply offered a small smile and told them not to worry. I'm just going to take a quick look around. You all head back first, she insisted calmly. She promised to retreat immediately if things turned sour, and seeing her resolve, the disciples stopped trying to persuade her. After all, their senior sister was one of the few in the Xianing sect who could wield wind-based spells with such effortless grace. We learned that 2 weeks ago, 3 elders of the sect were suddenly killed, and they had followed the trail all the way to this spot. The young woman walked forward a bit further, certain she had heard a faint sound coming from the shadows. She was sure she hadn't misidentified the aura of a true demon, yet she couldn't understand why it had vanished so abruptly. Her junior brothers couldn't explain what had happened either, so she cast another searching glance toward the mountain wall. Deciding not to venture deeper into the dark, she told herself it would be better to return and investigate by the light of day. Su Ran followed the young woman back to the small town with silent footsteps, curious why the sect had traveled thousands of miles to be here. Something was definitely wrong, and she felt she still owed the Xianing sect a life for the kindness she once received. It was time to repay that debt, even if, to be perfectly honest, the payment was about 1,000 years overdue. She hoped that senior sister wouldn't hold the delay against her as she checked into a room at the very same inn where they were staying. And while the Xianing disciples had placed isolation spells on their rooms, such barriers were completely useless against someone of her caliber. She leaned her ear against the wall to eavesdrop, even though, strictly speaking, such a physical gesture wasn't necessary for her. But she felt it added a certain sense of immersion to the act. After all, if one is going to spy, one might as well look the part. Inside, we hear the young woman questioning the 3 disciples about their encounter with the true demon. They explained that they caught a faint glimpse of someone saving them, but as for who that person was, they couldn't say. They had lost consciousness before seeing a face. Deep down, the senior sister knew a true demon wouldn't simply give up like that. Still, she told them that since a mysterious expert had intervened, they should focus entirely on their recovery. She insisted they leave the matter of the murdered elders to her and return to the sect once their wounds had healed. This was the mystery at hand. The elders of the Xianing sect were at the peak of the golden core or even the nascent soul stage. For such powerful cultivators to be killed so easily suggested that a true demon must have been the culprit. Yet, with the sect currently energized by Shinju's influence, it seemed the wrong time for the demon race to provoke them. Once her eavesdropping was finished, Su Ran reached out to communicate with the sea spirit, Hai Sheng. She figured the simplest way to understand the demon race's motives was to ask one, as the logic of different beings can be quite alien. When Su Ran asked why the demons would choose this specific moment to attack cultivators, even Hai Sheng seemed puzzled. As it turns out, the demon race rarely bothers with reasons or long-term planning before they act. Hai Sheng shook his head, clearly finding it amusing that Su Ran would even look for a logical explanation. After learning this, Su Ran nodded to herself, realizing that the demon race truly is a species that acts solely on whim and personal preference. It was a philosophy of absolute self-indulgence. As long as they are happy, nothing else matters. Even if others must die for that happiness, so be it. To be honest, Su Ran found herself slightly admiring such a blunt way of living. However, for a society to function with that level of chaos, she thought the demon king must be an incredibly formidable leader. Su Ran remained in the small town for 2 days, quietly following the young woman the entire time to see where the trail might lead. The young woman eventually decided to have one of her companions escort the 3 injured disciples back to the Xianing sect. She, however, remained behind with the remaining 4 to continue the investigation. After 2 days of quiet observation, Su Ran finally learned the young woman's name, Jun Chuan. The surname Jun was one she recognized immediately. The last time Su Ran had heard it was from the senior sister who had looked after her at the Xianing sect, though they had only met a few times. Even so, Su Ran had a very high opinion of senior sister Jun Miao. It might sound a bit odd to put it this way, but she had truly felt a sense of maternal warmth from Jun Miao. Thinking about it now made Su Ran feel a little embarrassed. The woman wasn't that much older than her, yet she had actually felt the urge to call her mother at one point. If anyone ever found out about that particular thought, they would likely think she had completely lost her mind. As night fell, Su Ran managed to intercept and copy a message sent from the Xianing sect. It was a direct order from the sect leader to Jun Chuan, telling her to return to the sect with all possible haste. The situation had escalated beyond control. An entire sect in the West Sea had been slaughtered. It was no longer something the Xianing sect could keep quiet. Su Ran lay on her bed, carefully reading the contents of the letter. It seemed that true demon had caused quite a stir. No wonder the creature had acted with such arrogant confidence. She set the letter aside and went back to eavesdropping. Although Jun Chuan was willing to return as ordered, she felt a lingering sense of frustration. She was so close to uncovering the true demon's trail, or so she believed. In reality, if she had actually found that demon, she would have only been leading her fellow disciples to their certain deaths. After some hesitation, Jun Chuan chose to retreat. That very night, the 5 of them checked out of the inn and departed. Su Ran, however, chose not to follow them. Watching the drama unfold shouldn't have to be such a tedious chore, after all. Besides, she felt her debt to the Xianing sect was paid. They had saved her life once, and she had returned the favor several times over. And so, Su Ran decided to stay in the small town for one more peaceful night. She waited until the next morning to check out and depart. Although the sect didn't plan on hiding the truth from other organizations, judging by the calm demeanor of the common folk, they likely had no idea a true demon had just slaughtered an entire sect. When she asked if there were any maps available, the shopkeeper eagerly pulled out a massive, cluttered pile of them. Some were even covered in thick layers of dust, yet the shopkeeper began praising them as if they were priceless treasures. Su Ran sifted through the collection and eventually selected a map that covered the entirety of the cultivation world. Seeing her choose the broad overview map, the shopkeeper secretly thought this young girl simply didn't know her business. In his mind, one should buy the most detailed maps possible, not something so vague it was practically unreadable. After all, the cultivation world is vast. Most people in this world spend their entire lives within a single country, or even a single county, never finding a way out. Why would would anyone need a map of the whole world? Actual cultivators have their own specialized maps, of course, and would never have a use for a commoner's chart. Though the shopkeeper was mocking her internally, he kept a bright smile on his face while giving Su Ran his best sales pitch. Su Ran couldn't have cared less about his private thoughts. She simply took the map, paid the man, and went on her way. Finding a quiet spot beneath a tree, she sat down and began using her spiritual energy to sketch out the surrounding regions. She carefully added every place she had visited recently, watching as a small section of the map became intricately detailed. Suddenly, the idea of traveling across the entire cultivation world seemed like a rather pleasant prospect to her. That grand journey would have to wait, however. Her first destination was Qingshui town to the north. She planned to wander elsewhere later, and by noon, she had already resumed her trek toward the northern territories. After traveling for several days, she reached a larger city. There, Su Ran set aside the magic cores and beast horns she needed, and took the rest of her loot to the local merchant guild to sell. While she was finalizing the transaction, the receptionist noticed the high quality of Su Ran's materials and pointed toward the mission board scrolling in the main hall. "Tell me, immortal master," the receptionist asked with a smile, "would you be interested in taking on a few missions? Our guild has branches across the entire cultivation world, so you can turn in your completed tasks at any location. We learned that these guilds rose to prominence a century ago, when someone noticed that many sect disciples lacked the silver to buy spiritual tools, while the magic cores and hides of demonic beasts were in high demand among the wealthy nobility. And so, the very first merchant guild was born. After 100 years of development, there are now over a dozen major guilds operating throughout the cultivation world. The largest and oldest remains the Wanhai Guild, which has established branches even in small towns near the Great Forest. With the sudden surge of rogue cultivators over the last 3 years, business has been booming like never before. As the guilds fill their coffers, Su Ran turns her attention to the scrolling list of available missions. The most difficult tasks involve capturing high-level demonic beasts alive, a feat easier said than done. Su Ran wasn't quite sure why anyone would want a live beast. Surely they weren't keeping them as pets. Curious, she leaned in and whispered to the receptionist, "Why capture them alive? What use are they? Even nobles shouldn't be able to control such creatures," she noted, genuinely puzzled by the logistics. "After all, an uncontrolled beast is just a hungry predator." "Don't worry," the woman replied, "our Colosseum needs them. We have specialized masters who use beast binding ropes to ensure they won't harm the spectators." The woman whispered back that it wasn't exactly a secret. The wealthy simply love watching demonic beasts fight. They even place massive bets on the outcome. Su Ran then asked how much a high-level beast was actually worth. The receptionist had originally intended to suggest low-level tasks, but seeing the quality of Su Ran's loot, she realized this young woman clearly had the skills for more. For a single high-level beast, the reward starts at a minimum of 100,000 silver taels, with no upper limit. The price for wind element demonic beasts is particularly high, almost always starting at 1,000,000 silver taels. These creatures aren't just fast, their alertness is far superior to other beasts, and for 50 years now, not a single high-level wind beast has been captured in the cultivation world. When Su Ran heard that million tael starting price, her eyes practically lit up. After all, it had taken her 1,000 years to save up that much. She couldn't help but wonder why no one had told her about such a lucrative opportunity sooner. Ultimately, Su Ran chose a mid-level mission. She told herself it was better to keep a low profile for now. Showing up with a high-level wind beast immediately might be a bit too shocking for the locals, wouldn't it? The items she brought today sold for a total of 2,000 silver taels, which came as a pleasant surprise. In the past, she could never get such a fair price. It seems people used to take advantage of her unassuming appearance. She took her silver and turned to leave. While she wasn't exactly desperate for money, building a spiritual energy satellite requires quite a lot of resources, and the surplus materials could always be sold later. However, Su Ran didn't expect to be targeted by bandits the moment she left the city. They had been following her since the guild entrance. She had noticed their suspicious behavior earlier, of course, but she hadn't paid them much mind. Yet, when they actually jumped out to rob her, she found herself feeling a bit nervous. This was, after all, the very first time in 2 lifetimes that she had actually been mugged. 2 of them were at the Foundation establishment stage. They appeared to be rogue cultivators who assumed she was an easy target simply because she looked weak. "You've made quite a bit of money, haven't you, little sister?" one of them sneered, clearly underestimating her. They told her that if she just handed over half of her earnings, they wouldn't make things difficult for her. He said it as if he were doing her a favor. "So, you're actually robbing me?" Su Ran asked, almost in disbelief. "Don't put it like that," they replied. "We're all rogue cultivators here, but we have sick mothers at home to care for." The man spoke with a face full of sincerity, claiming they needed the silver for medical treatment and would pay her back later. The others nearby nodded in agreement. Su Ran had honestly expected them to come up with something a bit more original. Instead, it was just the same old cliches. She decided she wasn't interested in wasting any more time dealing with these people. Without a word, she punched the man right in front of her, knocking him unconscious. His companions were instantly terrified. Their leader was at the Foundation establishment stage, yet he had been knocked out by a mere chi refiner. "How dare you hit someone?" another shouted. "Now you'll have to pay for his medical expenses." The other Foundation establishment cultivator spoke up immediately, acting as if demanding money was now perfectly reasonable. Su Ran truly hadn't expected their skin to be quite this thick. It was almost impressive, in a way. They were actually trying to scam her after she defended herself. Exactly. You can't just hit someone and not pay up. The remaining men joined in the shouting, secretly thinking their leader's acting was brilliant for looking so genuinely unconscious. "You want medical fees, do you?" Su Ran replied. "Fine, I'll give them to you." Su Ran wasn't typically a person with a bad temper, and since they insisted on medical fees, she decided to comply. After all, she was the one who had injured him. She weighed the storage bag in her hand for a moment. Then, she proceeded to beat the rest of them until they couldn't crawl away, leaving them groaning on the ground in pain. Su Ran glanced at the one terrified youth who was still standing. "Here, take the medical fees. Make sure you find a doctor with decent skills," she added, tossing a bag of silver coins toward him. She then gave the young boy a stern warning, noting that he was far too young to be following thugs and robbing people. The boy watched Su Ran's retreating back as she walked away with her head held high, leaving a trail of defeated men behind. He looked at the unconscious group on the ground and, without a second thought, grabbed the money bag and bolted. He hadn't been the one Su Ran hit, and with this money, he could finally take his mother to the big city for help. He decided to sever ties with those people forever. As evening fell, Su Ran found a quiet cliffside to rest for the night. We see her hands busy constructing the framework for a spiritual energy satellite. While pure energy works, it has its limits. Without a physical medium, the energy would simply dissipate. In just a few days, her satellite would vanish into thin air. To maintain the flow, she needed a vessel. Truthfully, a human dantian would be the most effective medium for this. But Su Ran wasn't about to go around harvesting people's internal organs just for a satellite. She had standards, after all. Instead, she looked toward magical beast cores as a substitute. These cores don't just power formations, they are versatile tools. They can actually store spiritual energy. To put it in modern terms we'd understand, they are essentially power banks. The cultivation world does have its own version of power banks, known as spirit stones, which every cultivator uses. However, spirit stones are expensive and strictly single use. If left outside a storage ring, their energy slowly leaks away. Su Ran realized that these cultivators were perhaps a bit too focused on traditional training. They lacked a certain creativity. They rarely considered anything beyond raw combat power. When Su Ran first arrived in this cultivation world, she felt out of place. There was a period of adjustment, certainly, but that discomfort didn't last as long as one might expect. Despite the lack of internet or smartphones, Su Ran felt that returning to the modern world might actually be harder now. She found spiritual energy to be far more useful than any technology. It was, in her eyes, the ultimate tool. With enough imagination, this energy could do anything, even simple tasks like acting as a paintbrush. As As long as she had energy, she could manifest the images in her mind into reality. It was quite a convenient skill. Of course, both demons and cultivators simply dismissed this kind of technique as mere illusion magic. Shaking off these wandering thoughts, Su-Ran returned her focus to the task at hand, working on the beast core. An earth-type core is best for storing energy, but her satellite design was much better suited for a wind-type core. This left her in a bit of a dilemma. To make it work, she would need to find a high-level beast with both elements. But magical beasts are quite different from humans. While humans can master dual elements, beasts are another story entirely. Demons, magical beasts, and spirit beasts are all limited to a single elemental talent, meaning a dual element beast simply shouldn't exist. Su-Ran tried to cast a wind-type formation onto an earth-type beast core, but the results were far from ideal. It simply didn't reach the level of precision she needed, and trying it the other way around yielded the same disappointing results. This was the first time Haixing had seen Su-Ran look so genuinely frustrated, and he found it rather amusing, to be honest. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what this young woman was actually trying to achieve with all those cores and floating formations. None of them seemed to have any offensive power at all, so Haixing decided to speak up, almost as if trying to be helpful. He suspected that a human wouldn't trust a demon like him, but every word he was about to say was the absolute truth. After all, if Su-Ran could finish this satellite project sooner, he might finally be granted his own freedom. Su-Ran was a bit surprised by his input. She hadn't expected a demon to offer her any genuine assistance. She had assumed Haixing was just planning to outlive her in a battle of patience. She explained she needed a dual element beast. Specifically, she wanted to find one with both earth and wind attributes so she could harvest its core for her work. It was a bold ambition, searching for a creature that defied the natural laws of this world, and even she felt the weight of it. As soon as Haixing heard that Su-Ran was looking for a dual element magical beast, he was momentarily stunned into silence. Where on earth was she supposed to find such a creature? It was, by all accounts, a practical impossibility. It's true that some demons, in their pursuit of absolute power, would attempt to practice dual element techniques. However, the success rate for such an endeavor was incredibly low, often leading to disastrous consequences. Practicing two elements requires more than just balancing the conflict between opposing forces. It is a delicate, dangerous dance. Most importantly, the mana required for dual systems often becomes chaotic, leading to a total loss of control, or worse, a violent explosion. Unless they are absolutely desperate, a demon would never dream of attempting to master more than one element. In his view, only reckless humans would dare to try such a thing, mostly because they are inherently so weak. Growing up with dual element foundations and diverse diets, human bodies are naturally quite cluttered and impure. Paradoxically, this makes it easier for them to manage dual systems, provided the talents don't directly conflict. In fact, it can make a human cultivator even stronger. But Haixing's sudden silence was starting to become unnerving. Su-Ran hadn't expected him to go so quiet, and to be honest, the silence was making her a bit uneasy. She knew that finding a dual element magical beast was a total pipe dream, but she held on to the slim hope that one might exist. One shouldn't be too absolute about these things. After all, there is rarely a situation where the chance is zero. First of all, any magical beast capable of mastering two elements would already be on par with a divine beast. It was almost unthinkable. In over 1,000 years of life, Haixing had never even laid eyes on a dual element beast. Su-Ran understood the difficulty of capturing a divine level beast, especially since she hadn't seen a divine beast in a millennium either. Because of this, she wasn't even entirely certain if such creatures were real or merely myths. After Haixing finished speaking, Su-Ran fell into a deep, contemplative silence of her own. Disturbed by her lack of response, Haixing repeated himself, practically begging her to say something to break the tension. And so, the human and the demon sat in total stillness, with only the rhythmic chirping of crickets filling the night air. It wasn't until a golden bird streaked across the sky that Su-Ran finally snapped out of her trance. She widened her eyes, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her as that golden light cut through the darkness. As it vanished into the eastern horizon, she realized it looked exactly like the legendary divine beast, the vermilion bird. This time, even Haixing was speechless. It was the very first time he had witnessed such a sight. It seems if you live long enough, you really do see everything, though their excitement wasn't just about seeing a legend. Rather, it was the realization that if the vermilion bird existed, then other legendary divine beasts must be real too. If even divine beasts exist, then she reasoned that magical beasts with dual element talents might actually be real too. Su-Ran was delighted, though the sudden appearance of this vermilion bird did leave her lost in thought for a moment. She wondered if the appearance of such a creature held some deeper meaning, perhaps the arrival of a legendary hero. And we see that Su-Ran wasn't the only one. Every sect in the entire cultivation world had witnessed the bird's flight. Even the common folk saw it, and by the next day, rumors were spreading about a divine bird heralding a new era. They believed peaceful days were coming to the human world. Later, while Su-Ran was stopping in a small town for lunch, she overheard people at the next table discussing the divine bird and how its appearance was a sign of great things. They claimed the human race was at a turning point and that the demons were no longer a significant threat. Some even suggested the demons might be wiped out entirely, claims that Su-Ran listened to without much of a reaction. Haixing, however, was practically rolling around in his space with laughter. The idea of humans exterminating demons was absurd. As long as humans exist and their resentment remains, he knew that demons would continue to appear indefinitely. After all, the first demons were born from human inner shadows. The idea of them being truly eliminated was a fantasy. Deep down, Su-Ran felt that the appearance of a divine beast probably didn't signify anything quite so grand. To her, it was likely just a divine beast moving house in the middle of the night, which, naturally, someone happened to see. In a world where immortals exist, divine beasts are only to be expected. What Su-Ran cared about much more was whether a dual element magical beast actually existed within the many vast forests of the cultivation world. Humans rarely venture deep into these woods, choosing instead to build their kingdoms and towns around the forest edges. Looking at a map, the continent of this world resembles Earth's equator, a long, narrow strip wrapping around the planet. However, instead of running horizontally, it stretches vertically across the globe like a massive ribbon. Aside from this singular, giant landmass, the rest of the world is comprised only of the east and west oceans. Not far from the main continent, several islands dot the ocean, but as for the very center of the east and west seas, that remains a place where no one has ever set foot. Su-Ran took a moment to calculate the area of this cultivation world. She estimated it to be roughly 10 times the size of Earth. Even though the landmass of this world is just a narrow strip of land, the distance stretching from the east to the west is still about 30,000 miles, and the distance required to circle the entire globe is simply beyond estimation. After finishing her lunch, Su-Ran was just about to leave when she saw a group of people distributing red envelopes to the sound of gongs and drums. Even Su-Ran, who was just passing by, was handed 3 copper coins while the leader of the group chanted auspicious words. It turned out that a local family had a child born in the middle of the night, just as the divine bird was flying overhead. Naturally, the family was overjoyed by the omen and began handing out red envelopes right there in the street. They wanted everyone to share in their good fortune, and although it was only 3 coins, Su-Ran was quite happy to receive the gift, even deciding to visit their home to offer a few words of blessing. When she arrived at the family's front gate, she found that a large crowd had already gathered there. Everyone had come specifically to offer congratulations after receiving their envelopes. There were even cultivators present in the courtyard. Su-Ran followed the flow of the crowd inside, noticing bowls of candies and melon seeds placed along both sides. These were likely meant for the children, but she didn't hesitate to grab a few handfuls and stuff them into her bag. As she looked up, she locked eyes with a young disciple standing behind a cultivator, but Su-Ran didn't care one bit about his judgmental gaze. She simply grabbed 2 more handfuls of candy and tucked them away. After all, she wasn't here for nothing. While Su-Ran was happily snacking, a man approached her to strike up a conversation. The man looked to be about 30 years old, dressed in fine robes with a face full of joy. He was presumably the master of the house, and he greeted her warmly, honored that an an immortal master would grace them with her presence. My Lin family is truly honored by your presence, the man said, his face lighting up as he saw Su Ran acknowledge him. His smile grew even wider as he thought of his newborn daughter, who entered the world just as a divine bird flew overhead. The immortal masters who came to see the omen didn't turn him away, and he had even encountered wandering cultivators. To him, it was clear his daughter was a child of great fortune. Not at all, not at all, Su Ran replied modestly. She was still clutching a handful of pastries, and being spotted by Master Lin made her feel a bit self-conscious. Master Lin, being a man of great tact, simply smiled and invited Su Ran to the backyard. He asked her to offer a few auspicious words for his newborn daughter, since Su Ran was, after all, a cultivator. He hoped his daughter might catch a bit of that immortal essence. Su Ran, however, didn't feel particularly immortal. Still, she couldn't very well refuse. As she watched the wet nurse bring the infant out, she recited every blessing she could think of before reaching into her bamboo basket to pull out a piece of jade. Please, give this jade to the young miss, she said. It has been by my side for a very long time. She explained that it held a bit of spiritual energy, enough to protect the child from illness and harm. Su Ran handed the stone to Master Lin. To be honest, it was just a pebble she usually tossed around for fun, but it had indeed been with her for 1,000 years, which meant it had practically been polished into a spiritual treasure. The moment Master Lin took the jade, he felt a sudden wave of clarity and refreshment wash over him. Naturally, he began to treasure it even more. He initially insisted that Su Ran stay for dinner, but when she mentioned she had a journey to continue, he had his servants pack her a large bag of pastries. They were the exact same flavor she had been sneaking earlier. As she left the town, Su Ran couldn't help but giggle. Trading a single stone for a mountain of delicious treats felt like the best bargain she had ever made. And as news of the divine bird's appearance spread, a new fever for cultivation began to sweep across the land. Even our friend Su Ran, as she strolled down the street, found a flyer shoved into her hand about a great immortal recruiting disciples. There was no need to wait for next year. Apparently, one could sign up for the selection process right this very moment. Su Ran stared at the flyer and fell into deep thought. It seemed that humans, no matter the era, always loved a good bargain. Where there is one, there are many, and suddenly the entire cultivation world was buzzing with this newfound excitement. However, Su Ran felt that while cultivation shouldn't be stifled by too many rules, complete chaos was just as bad. After all, once someone begins to cultivate, they become far more powerful than any ordinary mortal. If someone with a crooked heart becomes a cultivator, we end up with people like those bandits she encountered before. They do whatever they please, relying solely on their cultivation level. But once a person joins a proper sect, this kind of bullying is strictly forbidden. No matter how small the sect might be, they usually have standards. In fact, their rulebooks can easily reach 30 pages. Naturally, many people simply cannot endure such discipline. And this is precisely why rogue cultivators exist. Most of them were originally disciples of a formal sect, but because they broke the rules or couldn't stand the restrictions, they left to practice on their own. Quite a bold move, really. Without a sect to guide them, they have to figure everything out by themselves, which is especially dangerous during breakthroughs. Without an elder or a master nearby to provide guidance, it is incredibly easy for the advancement to end in failure. So, if we ever meet a high-level rogue cultivator, it means they are exceptionally talented and very good at fighting. Su Ran eventually tossed the flyer aside. To be honest, she wasn't particularly impressed by the offer. She suspected these rogue cultivators either wanted to start their own sect or were just using the hype to make a quick buck and run. Imagine the scene, many wealthy young masters and ladies who possess absolutely no talent for cultivation at all. But when a rogue cultivator claims they can cultivate as long as they pay, those pampered children will certainly flock to them. In their eyes, having the status of a cultivator is just like owning a modern luxury designer bag, a mere status symbol. It was a status symbol, but those rejected by the major sects were truly not suited for the path of immortality. If a massive enterprise couldn't make it work, a small personal workshop certainly wouldn't have a chance. So, one look at that flyer told Su Ran it was a scam. If cultivation were really that easy, then everyone in the world would be an immortal. After that, she continued toward a town on the forest's edge. In towns like these, we often find many mission squads from various sects stationed nearby. They live here permanently and understand the magical beasts in the forest far better than she ever could. When Su Ran entered the town, it was like a rabbit walking into a wolf's den, with everyone casting curious glances her way. She found the town's only inn and checked in. As the waiter watched her settle in, he seemed to hesitate, as if wanting to say something, but in the end, he remained silent. People who come to a place like this are either here on orders or driven by the harsh realities of life. Seeing this young girl in tattered clothes with an ancient basket on her back, he assumed the worst. Clearly, she was here for the money. Su Ran, however, didn't care what the waiter thought of her. Once inside her room, she began eavesdropping, though most of the chatter she heard was utterly useless noise. Finally, she caught something useful, a plan to besiege a high-level magical beast the following morning. One voice asked if preparations were complete, while another stammered out a rather problematic explanation. Everything was ready, but the person hired to act as the bait had suddenly backed out of the deal. Feeling the group was unreliable, the bait had fled in the middle of the night. The leader's voice grew cold. Without bait, they couldn't lure the beast out. He ordered his subordinate to go find a replacement immediately. The other man fell silent, knowing that being the bait meant a 90% chance of certain death. Even if the captain promised to keep them safe, a promise in the cultivation world is worth very little indeed. Asking someone to act as live bait is a cruel business. Naturally, no one in their right mind would ever volunteer. But then, we see Su Ran overhear the rest of the conversation. This beast was a rare dual-element wind and earth type. Specifically, it was the creature's magical horn that their primary client was after. The leader warned that if they failed to secure it, they would all suffer. Su Ran hadn't expected her target to be found so soon. If they only wanted the horn, she wondered if the magic core could be hers for the taking. And if they refused to share, well, she could always just take it by force. So, when the team began searching for their bait, Su Ran approached them with a look of pure, innocent sincerity and asked if they were hiring. In her hand, she held a flyer, a recruitment notice the team had hastily put together just moments ago. She had snatched it up the second they posted it. To be honest, if she hadn't been trying to look composed, she would have grabbed it right out of their hands before it even touched the wall. The three men looked at each other in disbelief, wondering why a 14-year-old girl was answering their call. They asked if she could even read, emphasizing that they were going after a high-level magical beast. They questioned if she understood the danger, noting that such a hunt required a cultivation level of at least foundation building. They looked her up and down, clearly able to tell that she was a cultivator, albeit a seemingly weak one. In the eyes of a high-level beast, Su Ran's current cultivation made her little more than an appetizer, hardly better than a commoner. However, she pointed out that their flyer explicitly stated there were no cultivation requirements for those willing to join. It also mentioned that any request could be negotiated, so she saw no reason why she should be rejected. Seeing that Su Ran was dead set on joining them, the three men had no choice but to lead her back to their base. They arrived at a large, independent courtyard where many people were already gathered. It was quite clear that they had prepared extensively for the hunt of this high-level magical beast. We see that the group even included a cultivator at the peak of the golden core stage, and though he hadn't made a move yet, Su Ran could sense his aura was that of a fire element, a natural talent for flames, it seemed. Another cultivator at the late golden core stage possessed the wood element. Together, the two of them could effectively counter the wind and earth beast. It's no wonder they felt confident enough to skip hiring a nascent soul expert. The rest of the crew were mostly at the peak of foundation building. Still, Su Ran had her doubts. She felt that against a dual element wind and earth beast, this lineup might not actually be enough. The peak golden core leader looked Su Ran up and down. then turned his gaze toward the three men who brought her, his expression showing no attempt to hide his skepticism. Are you three actually serious? He asked. The trio looked quite ashamed of themselves. They explained that the young girl was insistent on joining and simply refused to give their recruitment flyer back. To be honest, they never imagined someone at the chi refining stage would accept such a mission, let alone a teenage girl. Su Ran ignored the judgment and asked if her only job was to lure the high-level beast into their prearranged formation. If I complete the task, she continued, can I really ask for anything I want as a reward? What Su Ran truly cared about, of course, was whether she could get her hands on that dual-element magic core. The leader frowned slightly. He clearly felt this little girl was treating a life-and-death hunt like a game. But time was running out. The sun would set in just 2 hours, and they were desperate. If they rejected her now, they would be forced to pick one of their own men to act as the live bait. Yes, he replied. As long as you lead the beast to the designated spot, you can have whatever you desire. He said the words, but the captain actually had very little confidence in the success of this mission. In his mind, he was already bracing himself for the punishment of failure. Then, can I have the beast's magic core? Su Ran asked. She looked at the captain with a face full of expectation, wondering if he would actually agree to such a bold request. Well, his luck was certainly holding out. The captain hadn't expected Su Ran to be quite so bold, or so demanding. To actually ask for the beast's magic core, the most valuable part of a creature, aside from its horns, was a massive request. We see that this young girl clearly knew her treasures. Aside from the captain, the rest of the hunters were stunned for a moment before they burst into collective laughter at her audacity. They wondered if they had misheard. This little girl actually wanted the core of a high-level beast, which, naturally, was absurd. A high-level core could fetch 1,000,000 silver pieces, and this one, despite its mixed earth talent, could easily sell for over 2 million. If they actually handed it over to this girl, their team's total profit would be cut in half. Su Ran, however, didn't care if they were mocking her. She remained completely indifferent. Her only goal was that dual-element wind and earth magic core. Deep down, she had her doubts about the captain's confidence. The sea god wouldn't have lied to her. Even the demon race rarely saw dual-element beasts, yet these humans didn't seem surprised at all. Instead, they acted as if victory were already theirs, but with a wind-earth beast, even with wood and fire counters. Imagine 80 people facing such a creature. Having even 5 survivors would be a miracle. In truth, Su Ran joined this luring mission partly to confirm if this high-level beast actually existed. She needed to see if their information was accurate. As the captain felt Su Ran's gaze on him, he felt an inexplicably heavy pressure weighing down on him. After a brief moment of thought, the captain finally agreed. Fine, he said, as long as the plan goes smoothly, you can have the core. He spoke the words, but left the second half of the thought unsaid. That is, of course, if she actually survived. A chi refiner often struggles to survive even a low-level beast, let alone a high-level one. But at this point, they simply had no other choice. Since someone was finally willing to act as bait, the captain decided it was best not to waste his own combat power. Every cultivator here had been trained at a great expense by his lord, and sacrificing even a single man would be a significant loss for their master. When the hunters heard the captain's words, their initial shock quickly faded. They hadn't actually expected him to agree to this young girl's demands. Go down and prepare first, the captain ordered. I will explain the details of the plan to this young lady. The captain knew exactly what his men were thinking, but at this stage, this was the only viable option left. With a wave of his hand, a spiritual energy map appeared before them. As he began his explanation, the map shifted and changed to match his words, making Su Ran's task perfectly clear. This particular beast had appeared in the forest half a month ago, and they had already clashed with it several times. Strangely, its aggression wasn't very high. Its attacks felt more like it was merely playing with them. Su Ran noted the dual wind and earth talents, which the hunters had discovered during those skirmishes. Sometimes it used wind spells, and other times it relied on earth magic. Once their lord learned of this, he demanded they capture the creature, specifically for its horns, which were excellent materials for magical tools. While the magic core was valuable, it required a complex purification process before it could actually be used. Ordinary cores couldn't be used directly, after all. Su Ran carefully committed the captain's map to memory. I've got it, she said. Don't worry, I will lead this high-level beast exactly to the destination. When it came to luring monsters, she felt a quiet sense of confidence. To be honest, she was quite good at it. In terms of pure speed, she had yet to meet a rival in the entire cultivation world. The captain watched her confident expression, unsure of what to say to such a bold claim. They waited until the sky turned completely dark, as that would be the time for their departure. The captain then led his team out to begin the mission. Our story continues as Su Ran takes the spirit stone to lure the beast, to ensure she could run fast enough. The men even gave her several wind element talismans. It all depends on you now. Do you remember the route? The captain looked at Su Ran's relaxed demeanor and couldn't help but offer a few more words of caution. While everyone else was treating this with deadly seriousness, Su Ran looked like she was merely going on a spring outing. She had even finished off the roasted chicken on the table. No one else had an appetite, yet she was eating for 2. Don't worry, Captain. I guarantee the mission will be completed, she said with a grin. Seeing the captain's stern expression, Su Ran snapped her heels together and gave him a playful, formal salute. The captain stared at this nonsensical gesture for a moment before finally waving her off to begin. Su Ran turned and left the camp without looking back. According to the captain's carefully laid plan, it would take the team about 2 hours to reach the location where they would set the trap. Su Ran was expected to find the beast within 90 minutes, but she reached its front door in just 10. The environment here was exactly as the captain had described, right down to the nest perched on the cliffside. Su Ran leaped up to the edge of the beast's lair, her hands gripping the branches that formed the nest's rim. She poked half her head over the edge to peer inside. Aside from 2 stray feathers, the nest was completely empty. It seemed the star of tonight's show was not at home. This left Su Ran a bit worried. If the main actor was missing, how was she supposed to put on a performance? She propped herself up and sat on the edge of the nest. The captain had left her plenty of time, so she decided to search the surrounding area. With a wave of her hand, one of the feathers inside the nest took flight. The feather began to drift forward. At first, Su Ran assumed the beast had headed deeper into the forest, but the further she went, the more she realized the direction was wrong. This was exactly where the captain had set the trap. She couldn't help but wonder if the beast was actually hunting the team. High-level magical beasts possess a certain intelligence, after all. It was perfectly normal for such a creature to think. As she followed the feather a bit further into the woods, Su Ran suddenly heard the unmistakable sounds of combat. She immediately dashed toward the noise to investigate. There, she discovered the massive bird, though its head was currently split into 2 distinct parts. 2 heads sharing a single body. Su Ran realized then why a dual-element beast hadn't been so easy to track down. This wretched double-headed bird had ruined her expectations. Meanwhile, the captain was equally stunned by this turn of events. He hadn't expected the beast to set an ambush here, nor that their carefully prepared traps would already be destroyed. Before they could even react, several cultivators had already been lost to the creature's initial strike. He had been careless, failing to account for the possibility that the beast could locate their hidden traps. It had even been waiting for them. Suddenly, a violent, suffocating wind swept across the battlefield. Its combat power was easily 5 times greater than during the town's attack. The captain and vice-captain barely withstood 2 moves. Even though their elemental talents should have countered the beast, the massive gap in raw power made it irrelevant. In the face of such overwhelming strength, their tactical advantage felt insignificant. By the time Su Ran arrived, over a dozen bodies were already scattered across the ground. The number of survivors didn't seem to add up either. It seemed 20 or 30 people had managed to flee, leaving the 2 golden core cultivators to hold the beast back. However, looking at the state of the 2 leaders, it was clear they wouldn't be able to hold out for much longer. Su Ran casually picked up a stone from the ground and hurled it with incredible force at the double-headed bird. The beast, which had been just about to launch a finishing blow, was suddenly forced back a few steps by the impact. That brief moment gave the two leaders a much-needed chance to breathe and put some distance between themselves and the monster. Once they were back within their effective range, the vice captain's spells could finally be put to good use again. The surrounding branches instantly surged forward, forming a massive wall of timber between the humans and the beast. Seeing that the vice captain's spell had successfully raised a barrier, Su-ran decided to pluck the leaves she'd used for camouflage off her face. She had originally intended to stay in disguise for a while longer, but now it seemed entirely unnecessary. Watching the beast take flight, Su-ran was already waiting in the air, having perfectly predicted its every move. It makes one wonder if birds ever tire of this tactic. Whether it's a high-level beast or a common sparrow, they always try to fly when cornered. A bird is a bird, after all, and habits are hard to break. As it ascended, Su-ran simply kicked it straight back into the dirt. The moment the beast hit the ground, she followed up with a heavy punch aimed directly at one of its two heads. The blow was so powerful it embedded the head deep into the earth. Before the second head could even react, Su-ran seized its neck with an invisible grip. The beast didn't even have time to let out a final cry before falling silent. As she looked down at the motionless double-headed bird, she heard movement coming from behind the wall of branches. She quickly plucked a feather from the carcass, stuck it on her head as a makeshift disguise, and vanished. A good while later, she finally reappeared, acting as if she had just arrived. "Captain, I checked the nest," she reported breathlessly, "but I didn't see the beast anywhere." Su-ran maintained the same humble posture she had when she first left the squad. The few survivors who were still standing turned their collective gaze toward her the moment they heard her voice. She was completely spotless. She looked exactly the same as she did when they had parted ways earlier. The captain felt a brief wave of relief seeing she was unharmed, but the gravity of their situation quickly snapped him back to reality. He immediately straightened up and questioned her. "You came from that direction. Did you see anyone else out there?" He knew they hadn't killed the beast themselves. They had barely been able to block its attacks, let alone find an opening to strike. Someone had clearly stepped in to help them. To be honest, they were lucky to be alive at all. But who would help them for no reason? Especially someone so powerful that the beast couldn't even offer a hint of resistance. This suggested their benefactor possessed a cultivation level beyond the spirit-severing stage, a power usually reserved for the ancient sects. They, on the other hand, were merely retainers serving a national aristocracy, far removed from such legendary heights. It seemed impossible that those exalted masters would go out of their way to help. "I didn't see anyone," Su-ran replied. "I just arrived." She explained that since she couldn't find the beast, she had taken a feather and used a tracking spell to find her way back. Su-ran maintained a perfectly innocent expression, even going so far as to hand the tracking feather over to the vice captain. Now, while it was technically just a feather, for a human, it was large enough that it had to be carried over one's shoulder. As she spoke, she turned and caught sight of the dead beast, jumping back in a display of pure, simulated shock. Watching her startled reaction, the vice captain couldn't help but think this young girl was incredibly lucky. Had she encountered the beast face to face, she would likely be sitting in its stomach by now, or so he assumed. They had been careless this time, mistakenly believing that the beast's combat power would be diminished. They thought its dual talents would weaken it, giving them the dangerous illusion that they could actually emerge victorious. Since Su-ran hadn't technically completed her specific task, the vice captain wasn't about to hand over the magic box just yet. However, he did provide her with a fair amount of silver and some talismans. "Even though you didn't fight," he noted, "you did help treat everyone's wounds and assisted in recovering the bodies of our fallen brothers." He told her she had earned this reward fairly. To be honest, her medical skills had been their only saving grace. He remarked on how skilled she seemed at these grim tasks, to which Su-ran simply responded with a silent thumbs up. And why wouldn't she be? After all, she had spent 10 long years doing exactly this kind of work. In her memory, those 10 years felt far longer than the 1,000 years of cultivation that followed. These were the survival skills she had relied on to stay alive. It was impossible for her to ever truly forget them. Back then, she only did these things because she was paid, a necessity of life that had now become a very convincing act. Even so, seeing these scenes again still made Su-ran feel a sense of melancholy. She wondered if they really had to throw their lives away like that. If it were for the sake of the world, perhaps it would be different. At least then their names might be remembered for generations. But to die for a single person was something Su-ran couldn't quite understand. Still, she told herself it was their life to live, and she had no right to interfere. Clutching her hard-earned rewards, Su-ran turned and finally left the squad's courtyard behind. She had originally hoped to find a dual-element wind and earth magic box, but it turned out to be a misunderstanding. Those things are never easy to find. However, the way that two-headed monster merged its heads and then split them apart gave Su-ran a sudden spark of inspiration. Perhaps a true dual-element beast could emerge from twin monsters. Imagine, for instance, two creatures born as twins. If one were to consume the other, over time, their magic boxes might fuse into a single dual-element core. Watching Su-ran walk away, clutching her silver with a look of dazed joy, the captain couldn't help but feel a bit sorry for her. To him, she looked desperately short on cash. Otherwise, why would she risk her life acting as bait? With that thought, the captain pulled out another 100 silver taels and handed them over, telling her to stop doing such dangerous work. He suggested that since she was young, finding a sect to join would be a much better path. He was an orphan himself, with no family to speak of. But facing a girl who looked 10 years younger than him, he felt a pang of sympathy he couldn't ignore. The captain's voice pulled Su-ran back from her thoughts, though she noted that the silver she already had was enough for her to throw 2 solid punches. And now here was another 100 taels. She had to wonder, was making money always this easy? People were handing out 100 taels on a whim, while a single wind element beast was worth millions. Times had certainly changed, and she felt she could hardly keep up. Naturally, Su-ran wasn't about to foolishly refuse the gift. She tucked the extra silver away and waved her hand, signaling that it wasn't that she didn't want to join a sect. She had realized that as long as one had money, they could go anywhere. It was the going part that she was hesitant about. The truth was, she simply didn't dare to go. Not yet, anyway. She realized it wasn't that she was refusing to join a sect out of spite. It was just that every time she met another human, she found herself repeating the same explanation over and over. The captain was a bit surprised by Su-ran's response, but he understood. Many rogue cultivators were often turned away by the big sects. People like Su-ran weren't exactly rare, and the captain knew he had already done all he could for her. As for what Su-ran decided to do next, well, that was entirely her own business. And so, he didn't try to stop her as she walked away. Su-ran stayed in the small town for just one more night. Early the next morning, she shouldered her small bamboo basket once again and began heading north. This forest was merely a small corner of the vast northern forest, and every step Su-ran took was automatically recorded on her map. It turns out that spending time with others does have its perks. While the combat power of the current cultivation world can't match that of 1,000 years ago, the variety of spells is far greater. This method of updating a map based on one's thoughts is incredibly convenient, to say the least. Su-ran traveled at her own pace, stopping and starting as she pleased, intent on mapping out every inch of this forest. However, when she finally pulled out her calendar to check the date, she was shocked to find that 2 whole years had slipped by. Naturally, she had lost track of time again. After a moment's thought, Su-ran decided to record some videos to send to Huichio. As long as Huichio picked up that mirror of his, he would be able to see these glimpses of her journey. She even thoughtfully added a voiceover for him. Once the videos were sent off to Huichio, Su-ran checked her own messages and saw that Shin Jianchuan had sent over quite a few updates. He mentioned that she had successfully completed her core formation, and the damage from the lightning tribulations had finally decreased. She was now on par with any other gifted cultivator, and the sect master of Tianzhao was currently studying the array she used. They were even preparing to share the secrets of that array with the world. This particular message, we should note, was nearly 2 years old. This meant that Shin Jianchuan had already become a golden core cultivator, a truly wonderful achievement, to be sure. After that, he had sent Su-ran holiday greetings over the years, with the most recent message arriving just 2 weeks ago. He mentioned that he was now engaged, and his fiancée was a fellow disciple from the Tianzhao sect who practiced alongside him. Because he had provided the array that helped those with lightning talents advance, he had been personally accepted as the sect master's disciple. His fiancée was actually the niece of the Tianzhou sect master himself, and reading this made Su Ran realize something important. Shen Jianchuan was 18 years old this year, an age where, in the modern world, one would still be a mere university student. But in this ancient setting, he had already reached the age for marriage and children. When she thought about it that way, she wondered if little Xiao Nian would also be ready for a family in just 2 more years. Time really does fly, doesn't it? Su Ran dismissed the message screen and prepared to enter the city. 2 years in an ancient era, she assumed, shouldn't bring about much change, and for the most part, her assumptions were quite correct. If this were the modern world, a few thousand years would lead to an era of high technology and rapid advancement. Yet in the cultivation world, even 10,000 years bring little change. In a world teeming with demons and magical beasts, simply being alive is considered a form of happiness. Naturally, no one is particularly focused on societal development. And most importantly, we must remember that this is simply how the logic of this world is written. No matter what changes occur, they won't happen quickly when the lives of immortals are measured in hundreds of thousands of years. To maintain that sense of eternal scale, the development of the mortal realm is slowed down 1,000-fold. Aside from some local accents and slight shifts in writing, the world looked much as it did 1,000 years ago. Even the fashion remained largely the same. Later, when a waiter arrived at her room to serve her dinner, Su Ran casually asked him why there were so many rogue cultivators wandering the streets lately. Upon hearing Su Ran's question, the waiter's face suddenly turned pale, as if he had seen a ghost. "Do you want to die?" he whispered, terrified that she would dare ask about the Heavenly Talisman sect. Su Ran was quite puzzled. She had no idea what this Heavenly Talisman sect even was. Seeing the waiter's fear, she decided not to press the poor man. Instead, she reached out to Shen Jianchuan to ask about the sect, requesting that he gather all the information he could find. "Organize everything for me," she told him. Less than 30 seconds after sending the message, she already had a response. We see that Shen Jianchuan was actually in the middle of a meditation session when the message arrived. He was a bit surprised to see his senior asking about the Heavenly Talisman sect, given how much noise they had been making. He assumed she must already know, but if his senior wanted the details, he was more than happy to provide them. In less than an hour, Su Ran received a complete dossier regarding everything known about the Heavenly Talisman sect. The sect had appeared only a year and a half ago, led by a master who emerged already at the formidable deity transformation stage. Before that moment, this mysterious figure had never been seen in public, but as soon as she appeared, she directly challenged the Qin Tian sect, one of the 10 great sects, and nearly wiped them out single-handedly. The Qin Tian sect focused on celestial observation and was famous for its many disciples with lightning-based talents. They were considered one of the strongest powers among the top 10 sects, which makes the next part even more shocking. If the mighty Qin Tian sect couldn't handle this person, the other sects certainly stood no chance at all. Eventually, the leaders of the cultivation world held a grand assembly just to negotiate a peace treaty with her. The sect master was a woman named Yi Wei, who wore white robes, carried a red umbrella, and walked barefoot. Worn-out bells hung from her wrists and ankles, which, strangely enough, only made a sound during the heat of battle. Most importantly, this Yi Wei was described as the ultimate nemesis of all traditional cultivators. She didn't use spells, focusing entirely on physical cultivation. Once she closed the distance, her opponents were helpless. As Su Ran read this, she began to form a mental picture of this formidable woman in her mind. This specific look reminded her of a classic villainess from a novel, the kind where the entire cultivation world has somehow betrayed her. And now, she had returned from the dead, determined to exact her revenge on every single sect in existence. Su Ran paused to wonder if she had perhaps missed something truly significant during her 1,000-year absence. We see that the Heavenly Talisman sect welcomed anyone who desired to cultivate, regardless of whether they actually possessed any talent. By simply opening the doors to everyone, the sect had managed to amass over 100,000 disciples. While that might seem like a drop in the bucket compared to the total population, we must look at the bigger picture. The combined disciples of all other major sects didn't even reach 30,000, making this number truly terrifying. After finishing the report, Su Ran sent a quick message of thanks to Shen Jianchuan for his efficiency. It seemed that even within the highest circles, no one had been able to uncover Yi Wei's true origins or background. Shen Jianchuan briefly considered asking Su Ran for her insight, but then remembered she hadn't even heard of the sect until today. He concluded she likely knew nothing of Yi Wei either. After dinner, Su Ran decided to head out for a walk. She noticed the spiritual energy of the cultivators nearby was incredibly murky. She wondered if this was the work of the demon race. Hearing Su Ran's question, Haixing simply rolled over lazily within the inner space, not looking particularly concerned. He noted that while their energy was indeed muddy, it certainly didn't belong to the demons. He told her not to blame everything on his kind. After all, the demon race has its own standards to uphold. Su Ran began quietly tailing a disciple of the Heavenly Talisman sect, sensing that something was fundamentally wrong with these people. Beyond the chaotic spiritual energy, there was a strange sense of discordance about them that she couldn't quite place. As they rounded a corner, Su Ran was nearly spotted, which came as quite a surprise to her. To be honest, few could match her when it came to being stealthy, yet this person had almost sensed her presence. Acknowledging that her target was more capable than they looked, Su Ran quickly cast a concealment spell to hide herself. She asked Haixing to layer another concealment spell over her, and though he grumbled about the extra work, he complied. With this double layer of protection, Su Ran followed her target without being noticed again. The target entered a large courtyard that appeared eerily quiet, as if no one actually lived there. Most importantly, the yard was protected by a powerful barrier that likely only permitted recognized signatures. Knowing she couldn't simply walk in, Su Ran pulled Haixing out from her inner space. Pointing at another approaching disciple of the Heavenly Talisman sect, she told him it was his turn to help. She reminded him that his kind could possess others, and despite his reluctance, her sincere gaze left him no choice. And so, he drifted over and quietly took possession of the disciple's body. Once Su Ran was certain the possession was successful, she found herself a well-hidden corner to wait. She opened a spiritual screen to link with Haixing's vision, a trick they had used often over the last 2 years. As we follow Haixing into the courtyard, we see that the interior has transformed into a completely different place. The surroundings were pitch black and filled with jagged rocks, where many other disciples were gathered. None of them spoke or even acknowledged one another as they moved through the field of stone. After crossing the rocky terrain, Su Ran finally spotted a black tower standing over 10 stories tall. The structure radiated a sense of profound danger as the disciple approached the main gate for inspection. Watching through the screen, Su Ran saw 2 white eagles at the entrance and felt a sudden surge of unease. She warned him to get out immediately, and Haixing, sensing the danger himself, didn't hesitate. He quickly jumped bodies as the disciple brushed past another person, moving with practiced speed. Although the barrier didn't trigger any alarms, Haixing couldn't shake a very unsettling feeling. It felt as though someone had just glanced directly at him, even as he took his first few steps away. The person he had previously possessed reached out to touch something, even though his head had already fallen off. Yet, the man didn't die. Instead, he remained on the ground, struggling in agonizing pain. Once they returned to Su Ran's inner space, Haixing immediately lost his temper. He accused her of having no regard for his life, certain she knew that place was a death trap. She calmly explained that she hadn't known at first. She only realized the danger after they entered that space. By now, Su Ran understood the strangeness of those people. Perhaps they carried a fragment of Yi Wei's divine soul. That would explain how they spotted her. After offering Haixing a few words of comfort, she turned her focus back. She repeatedly reviewed the footage on the spiritual screen, noting that since the place was hidden by a formation, it suggested the actual location wasn't there at all, but somewhere far away. The barrier acted much like a teleportation array, but having studied such things deeply, she had her doubts. She could rule out instantaneous teleportation, and if it were an illusion, Haixing certainly would have felt it. According to Haixing, who isn't exactly modest, he is the absolute absolute master of illusions in this cultivation world. If it wasn't a teleportation array or an illusion, then only one possibility remained. The Black Tower was an independent space, much like a storage realm, unaffected by the time of the outside world. Whatever entered that space became completely frozen in time. Su-Ran couldn't help but feel that this cultivation world was quite tragic, with its power balance completely shattered. It took thousands of years for a hero to kill the Demon King, yet only a few years after his death, a new threat had emerged, someone who harbored a deep, burning hatred for the great sects. If this continued, the sects wouldn't stand a chance. Under the cover of night, Su-Ran returned to the inn. Judging by the waiter's fearful attitude, it was clear the Heavenly Buddhist sect was viewed as a dangerous cult. Their reputation among the common folk was equally poor, leaving us to wonder what the Heavenly Buddhist sect was actually planning. She knew that simply thinking about it wouldn't provide answers, and asking them directly certainly wouldn't yield the truth. Even if the sect left a bad impression on both cultivators and civilians, she assumed they wouldn't resort to killing the innocent. At first, Su-Ran didn't understand why the people were so terrified, until several members of the sect burst into her room. They accused her of being a spy sent by the great sects, while the waiter who had served her stood by, trembling with fear. He looked at her with eyes full of apology. It was clear he hadn't intended for things to go this far. But the Heavenly Buddhist sect and the various sects were mortal enemies, and any cultivator entering their territory was a target. Everyone was interrogated. If they were truly rogue cultivators, they might just get a beating before being released. At most, they would suffer a few injuries, which, for a cultivator with high recovery speed, was a minor inconvenience. However, if the person turned out to be a disciple of a major sect, they were never seen again. They were given a simple choice: submit to the Heavenly Buddhist sect or face death. For the commoners, life had become a struggle. Over the past year, the suffering they endured felt even worse than the days of the demon race's invasion. Back then, the sect sacrificed so many disciples to slay the Demon King, yet this powerful new leader was nowhere to be found. One has to wonder why he didn't show off his strength against the demons. Su-Ran, noticing the waiter's gaze, calmly set down her teacup. She was the one who had actually killed the Demon King, after all. She caught the waiter's eye and lowered her cup once more. She understood the man was in a difficult position. When asked for a permit, she simply replied that she didn't have one. Su-Ran told the truth. She genuinely didn't possess such a thing. To be honest, she hadn't even known she needed one. For some reason, being asked for a permit felt like being told she needed a ticket to enter her own home. Since she lacked a permit, they declared her a trespasser and ordered her to be taken away immediately. Su-Ran was genuinely puzzled. After all, when she lived here, the Heavenly Buddhist sect didn't even exist. She pointed out that when the Heavenly Buddhist sect settled here, they hadn't exactly bothered to issue her a permit. After all, she had spent over 1,000 years in the cultivation world and had never once been asked for such a thing. Even the local government was flexible enough to let cultivators pass without the registration required of ordinary citizens. It seemed the Heavenly Buddhist sect and their followers didn't follow the usual rules of the land at all. Upon hearing Su-Ran's words, the leader's face turned dark with rage. How dare anyone resist the authority of their sect? Now, Su-Ran didn't want to cause trouble, but she certainly wasn't going to tolerate this kind of reckless behavior. We can compare it to the major sects. They don't farm their own land, so they must buy vegetables from the farmers. Usually, you pay extra for delivery, or send a low-ranking disciple like yourself to haul the goods back. But faced with the blatant arrogance of the Heavenly Buddhist sect, Su-Ran simply knocked them all to the floor. She told them that if they had a problem, they should send their leader to argue the case with her instead. If the leader's reasoning was convincing enough, she promised she would go with them quietly. Then, she sat back down. She picked up another cup from the table and began to pour, just as the tea hit the bottom of the cup. The voice of the umbrella monk reached her ears, noting that since she had invited the sect leader, he had to come. A young woman dressed in white, carrying a red umbrella, stepped through the doorway with an air of practiced grace. Her appearance matched Shinjianchuan's description perfectly, and as expected, the disciples of this sect carried traces of her divine power. This woman, Yi-Wei, had clearly heard the commotion. Yi-Wei sat down opposite Su-Ran, holding a teacup, and invited her to ask whatever was on her mind. When Yi-Wei smiled, it felt as if the room had suddenly filled with blooming flowers, a sight that would dazzle anyone else. Su-Ran, however, remained completely unmoved. She noted that, logically, the Heavenly Buddhist sect were the outsiders here. She asked why she, a longtime resident, needed a permit. The answer was simple: because Yi-Wei now ruled this land. Yi-Wei found it almost endearing that Su-Ran would ask such a naive question, since whatever she willed simply became the law. It was actually quite amusing to her. Su-Ran, however, simply looked at her and asked how she could be so certain. How do I know? Su-Ran repeated the question, her voice calm as she pressed for an answer. Yi-Wei wondered if this woman had been living in some remote mountain forest for the past 2 years to be so ignorant of the obvious. Su-Ran pointed out that while the sects might agree, they didn't represent her, and these rules were frankly quite inconvenient. She told Yi-Wei to change them. After all, Su-Ran planned to travel quite a bit in the future. Now that she knew she'd be interrogated everywhere within the Heavenly Buddhist sect's territory, she wasn't pleased. The thought gave her a massive headache, mainly because her true identity would be far too easy to expose. Even after decades, her appearance wouldn't change at all, and any spiritual mark would make that eternal youth far too suspicious. So, no matter how she looked at it, these sect regulations were clearly working against her interests. They could apply those rules to their own people, but not to her. Anything that inconvenienced her simply had to go. Yi-Wei remarked that her words were incredibly overbearing, even for a cultivator. To be honest, she wasn't wrong. She asked why on earth she, the sect leader, should change anything for her. It had been nearly 2 years since anyone dared speak this way. Su-Ran recalled what she had learned from Shinjianchuan, that this Yi-Wei was a specialist in close quarters combat. She knew a bit about these types of cultivators. A small fraction of them chose to focus entirely on physical techniques. But in close combat, unless one possesses overwhelming speed to crush everything, it is impossible to even get near an opponent. Su-Ran's eyes darted around playfully. She was suddenly quite curious to see just how fast this sect leader actually was. She pointed out it was just for her, one person. Come on, great sect leader, show a little mercy, she teased. Su-Ran gave a mischievous little laugh, having perfectly mastered the art of acting shamelessly, much like Hai-Shen. Yi-Wei had initially thought she had finally met someone with a bit of backbone in this cultivation world, but this was unexpected. Instead, she found another sycophant. Yi-Wei flatly refused, asking why on earth a sect leader should grant her such a special privilege. She was truly disappointed. Yi-Wei stood up, realizing she had mistakenly thought this young girl was someone truly formidable. It was a complete waste of time, she decided, and with a simple wave of her hand, the scene shifted violently. The people on the ground were instantly reduced to ashes, yet Su-Ran remained perfectly unharmed, calmly sipping her tea at the table. A flash of genuine surprise crossed Yi-Wei's eyes. After all, she had never seen anyone survive that particular move before. At this moment, Su-Ran finally understood just how fast Yi-Wei could be, though she had initially assumed the woman relied solely on speed. It turned out she was actually a mid-range fighter. We see now that Yi-Wei's umbrella was, in fact, a cleverly disguised sword. She had just watched those people being sliced into nothingness by the edges of that very umbrella. Now we understand why Yi-Wei could get so close to other cultivators without being stopped. She had preemptively set up a sword domain around her. Any incoming attacks were simply deflected by the hidden blade. But even with that trick, one had to admit that Yi-Wei's physical speed was still remarkably impressive. Refusing to believe what she saw, Yi-Wei prepared another strike, but before she could move, the umbrella vanished from her hand. Su-Ran was now holding Yi-Wei's umbrella, casually reaching out to flick the ribs of the frame with her finger. She remarked on how sharp it was. Not a single drop of blood remained after the slaughter. It was a masterpiece of thin, lethal blades. She wondered aloud if carrying such a sharp thing daily might lead to accidental cuts, before opening it to check and handing it back. Then, she addressed the great sect leader, asking what those sect members had actually done to provoke such a deep grudge. Su-Ran was genuinely curious. She wanted to know why Yi-Wei harbored such intense hatred for the established sects. It was only then that Yue realized Su Ran had simply leaned across the table to snatch the weapon right out of her grip. She hadn't sensed the movement at all. This meant that being discovered the previous night had been entirely intentional on Su Ran's part. It was all a ruse to lure her into a meeting. Meanwhile, inside Su Ran's space, even Haishin had begun to notice the shift. Inside the space, Haishin launched into a relentless verbal tirade against her, but Su Ran simply ignored the spirit's noisy complaints. At the moment, she was far more curious about the grudge between Yue and the sects. As Yue snatched her umbrella back, Yue claimed no one had actually provoked her. She simply couldn't stand the sight of them, which is a rather extreme reason for a massacre. Su Ran countered that by the great leader's logic, if someone else found her presence equally intolerable, they would be perfectly justified in wiping out her entire cult. With a casual turn, Su Ran began cleaning up the remains in the room. She wrapped the debris into several layers and placed it before Yue, politely suggesting she take her trash with her when she left. After all, it wouldn't be fair to make the waiter deal with such a mess. Su Ran maintained that same indifferent, calm expression. But now, Yue was breaking out in a cold sweat, realizing she had perhaps become a bit too arrogant and self-assured lately. For the past 6 months, she had been virtually invincible, with no one left brave enough to even challenge her authority. She wondered where this young girl had suddenly appeared from, as even those few brief exchanges had revealed a terrifying gap in power. Yue knew deep down she was no match for her. She suspected the girl was either hiding her true cultivation level, or using some incredibly sophisticated illusion. Instead of leaving, Yue turned back and decided to sit down once more. It was Yue's turn to seek a negotiation. She figured that since the girl asked about her grudge with the sects, then this mysterious stranger must surely be on their side. Su Ran, however, decided to be perfectly honest about her status. She explained that if Yue was asking about her past, she had indeed been a disciple of the sects once upon a time. But as for her current situation, well, she was now just a lone traveler with no allegiances whatsoever.
If you wanna go, then I'll be so lonely. If you leave me, don't slow me, let me down.